Plumbers unclogged a drain, and human organs slid out, exposing Germany's Ruhr Ripper after 21 hidden murders. The industrial fog hung thick over Duisburg on that grey March morning in 1976, carrying with it the acrid smell of coal smoke and steel foundries that had defined the Ruhr Valley for generations. Detective Chief Inspector Karl Schultz stood outside apartment building 24 Friedrichstrasse, watching as uniformed officers cordoned off the entire block with yellow tape. 21 years of police work had hardened him to most horrors, but nothing had prepared him for what awaited inside the cramped third-floor apartment, where Joachim Kroll had been quietly living as everyone's harmless neighbour. The call had come in at 11:47 a.m. from a frantic building superintendent reporting blocked drains throughout the complex. What began as a routine plumbing complaint would soon unravel one of Germany's most disturbing serial murder cases, a 21-year killing spree that had claimed at least 14 lives while the perpetrator remained hidden in plain sight, a soft-spoken lavatory attendant who collected rubber dolls and cooked human flesh in his tiny kitchen. But the story of Joachim Kroll begins not in that Duisburg apartment, but 43 years earlier in the rural village of Hindenburg, Upper Silesia, where on April 17, 1933, he entered the world as the youngest of 8 children born to Heinrich and Elisabeth Kroll. The timing was grimly prophetic, just months after Adolf Hitler's rise to power, in a region that would soon become a crucible of Nazi ideology and unprecedented human suffering. Heinrich Kroll worked the coal mines that scarred the Silesian landscape, his lungs slowly blackening with each descent into the earth's bowels. Elisabeth tended to their modest household with Germanic efficiency, though neighbours would later recall an emotional coldness that seemed to permeate the family dynamic. Young Joachim, pale and slight even as a toddler, occupied the periphery of family life, neither particularly loved nor actively despised, simply existing in the shadows of more assertive siblings. The first signs of disturbance manifested early. At age 4, Joachim would disappear for hours, only to be found in the village cemetery, sitting motionless among the weathered headstones. When questioned, he claimed to be talking to the sleeping people. His schoolteachers noted his peculiar fixation on death and decay, how he would meticulously dissect dead insects and small animals he found, studying their internal anatomy with an intensity that unsettled adults. The war years brought profound disruption to the Kroll household. Heinrich was conscripted into Wehrmacht labor battalions, leaving Elisabeth to manage the children alone while Allied bombers thundered overhead with increasing frequency. Food became scarce, rationing severe. It was during this period of deprivation that 11-year-old Joachim experienced what psychiatrists would later identify as his first sexual awakening, a disturbing conflation of hunger, violence, and arousal that would define his psychological development. In January 1945, as Soviet forces advanced through Silesia, the Kroll family joined the desperate westward refugee exodus. They travelled for weeks in bitter cold, part of a massive human tide, fleeing the advancing Red Army. Joachim later told investigators that during this journey, he witnessed scenes of rape, murder, and cannibalism among the starving refugees, images that allegedly planted the seeds of his future crimes, though experts would debate whether these accounts were genuine memories or self-serving fabrications designed to explain his pathology. The family eventually settled in Bottrop, a gritty industrial town in North Rhine-Westphalia. Heinrich found work in another mine, but the war's psychological toll had broken something fundamental in him. He began drinking heavily, becoming increasingly violent toward his wife and children. Joachim, now 12 and entering puberty, retreated further into himself, spending long hours alone in the cellar, fashioning crude dolls from scraps of fabric and wire. His mother, Elisabeth, noticed the dolls but attributed them to delayed emotional development rather than recognizing them as harbingers of future violence. They were disturbingly detailed female figures, often posed in positions of submission or distress. When confronted, Joachim would claim they were friends who didn't leave like everyone else. The lonely boy's attachment to these inanimate companions would persist throughout his life, eventually numbering in the hundreds. In 1947, Heinrich Kroll collapsed in the mine shaft, his damaged lungs finally surrendering to years of coal dust and cigarettes. His death devastated the family financially, but seemed to liberate something dark in 14-year-old Joachim. Freed from paternal authority, however minimal it had been, he began venturing farther from home, drawn to secluded areas where he could indulge his growing fascination with voyeurism and fantasy. The transformation accelerated after Elizabeth's death in 1949. At 16, Joachim found himself effectively orphaned, his older siblings having married or moved away. He took a job as a labourer at a steel mill, work that was physically demanding but provided the anonymity he craved. His co-workers would later remember him as unremarkable, quiet, punctual, neither friendly nor hostile. He seemed to exist in a social vacuum, interacting only when necessary for work-related tasks. It was during this period that Joachim made his first tentative steps toward violence. He began following young women as they walked alone, maintaining careful distance while fantasizing about what he might do if given the opportunity. He practiced these scenarios obsessively, refining his approach, identifying vulnerable targets, mapping escape routes. The methodical preparation would become his signature, meticulous planning executed with bureaucratic precision. The first murder occurred on February 8, 1955, though it would be decades before investigators connected it to Joachim Kroll. Irmgard Strahl, a 19-year-old factory worker, had finished her evening shift at a textile plant in Lüdinghausen and was walking the familiar route to her family's farm when she encountered a figure emerging from the shadows near a wooded path. Her body was discovered the following morning by a farm worker, partially clothed and bearing signs of sexual assault and strangulation. Local police investigated thoroughly, but found no meaningful evidence. The crime scene had been contaminated by morning frost, and there were no witnesses to the abduction. Irmgard's murder was filed away as an isolated incident, a tragedy, but not part of any larger pattern. This would become a recurring theme. Law enforcement's failure to recognize the methodical nature of Kroll's crimes, their tendency to treat each case as a standalone tragedy rather than pieces of a larger, horrifying puzzle. The second victim was 12-year-old Erika Schuletter, who vanished while walking home from school in Kirchhellen on June 17, 1959. Her small body was found 3 days later in a wooded area, bearing evidence of sexual assault and strangulation. The age difference between victims, an adult woman and a child, prevented investigators from immediately linking the crimes, a pattern that would persist throughout Kroll's killing spree. By 1962, Joachim had settled into a deadly routine. He worked various low-skilled jobs, janitor, labourer, eventually settling into a position as a public lavatory attendant in Duisburg. The work suited his psychological needs perfectly. It was solitary, routine, and provided ample opportunity to observe potential victims without arousing suspicion. He rented small, nondescript apartments, keeping to himself while methodically planning his next attack. The psychological profile that would eventually emerge painted a picture of a man driven by profound inadequacy and sexual dysfunction. Unable to form normal relationships with women, Kroll channeled his frustrations into elaborate fantasies of domination and control. His victims were chosen not randomly, but based on specific criteria: young, vulnerable, alone, with predictable routines that made them accessible targets. On August 22, 1965, 13-year-old Petra Giese disappeared while picking blackberries near her home in Marl. Her remains were discovered weeks later, showing the familiar pattern of sexual assault and strangulation. But there was something new. evidence that portions of flesh had been removed from the thighs and buttocks. The medical examiner noted clean cuts, suggesting the use of a sharp knife, though the purpose remained unclear. This marked Joachim's evolution from serial killer to cannibal, though the transformation was gradual rather than sudden. Later, psychiatric evaluations would reveal that his cannibalistic acts were not driven by hunger in any conventional sense, but by a pathological need to possess his victims completely. By consuming their flesh, he believed he could maintain a permanent connection with them, keeping them as part of himself forever. The cannibalism was methodical, almost clinical in its execution. Kroll would transport body parts back to his apartment, where he would carefully prepare and cook them using ordinary kitchen implements. He preferred certain cuts, tender portions from young victims, and would often mix human flesh with pork or veal to disguise the taste and texture. The practice continued for over a decade, undetected by neighbors who occasionally noticed unusual cooking odors, but attributed them to Kroll's reportedly poor hygiene and strange dietary habits. The investigation into these connected murders was hampered by jurisdictional issues and primitive forensic technology. Different police departments handled individual cases without sharing information effectively. There was no centralized database for tracking serial crimes, no behavioral profiling units, no sophisticated DNA analysis. Detectives worked with fingerprints, witness statements, and basic autopsy results, tools that proved inadequate against a methodical killer who left minimal physical evidence. Moreover, Joachim Kroll perfectly embodied the concept of the grey man, utterly unremarkable, invisible within society's fabric. He paid his rent on time, maintained employment, avoided criminal associates, and presented no obvious red flags to authorities. When questioned during routine canvassing of neighborhoods where crimes occurred, he appeared cooperative and helpful, just another concerned citizen horrified by the violence in his community. The murders continued with depressing regularity. 10-year-old Jutta Rahn vanished while playing near her home in Essen on September 26, 1966. Her body showed the now familiar signs of sexual assault, strangulation, and post-mortem mutilation. 13-year-old Ursula Rolling disappeared from Marl on December 22, 1966. Her remains discovered months later bearing identical injuries and evidence of flesh removal. Each crime generated intense media attention and public fear, but also public forgetfulness as months passed without arrests. Communities would mobilize briefly, organizing search parties, instituting curfews, demanding increased police presence. But collective memory proved short when no immediate resolution emerged. This social amnesia worked to Kroll's advantage, allowing him to continue operating in areas where heightened awareness might have made victims more cautious. The psychological pressure was building within Joachim himself, though it manifested not as guilt or remorse, but as an increasingly compulsive need to escalate his crimes. The intervals between murders shortened, and his selection criteria became less rigid. He began taking greater risks, operating closer to populated areas, keeping victims longer before killing them. On July 12, 1969, 4-year-old Gabriele Putman was playing in her family's garden in Grossenbaum when she vanished. Her body was found the next day, bearing evidence of the most brutal assault yet. The medical examination revealed extensive ante-mortem injuries, suggesting prolonged torture before death. Most disturbing was the precise removal of specific body parts, done with surgical skill that indicated intimate knowledge of human anatomy. This crime marked a turning point in the investigation. Detective Inspector Werner Klukas, newly assigned to head a special task force, began systematically reviewing all unsolved murders of women and children in the region, dating back to 1955. Working with primitive computer equipment, he identified patterns that previous investigators had missed: geographic clusters, similar victim profiles, consistent methodologies. The breakthrough came through an unexpected source. On March 3, 1976, the Duisburg apartment building at Friedrichstrasse 24 experienced a severe plumbing blockage that affected multiple units. When maintenance workers investigated, they discovered human remains clogging the building's main drain system. The superintendent, horrified by what appeared to be human intestines and tissue, immediately contacted police. Detective Chief Inspector Schultz arrived within the hour, accompanied by forensic specialists and the medical examiner. Initial examination of the organic material confirmed human origin, though determining the victim's identity would require extensive laboratory analysis. The building's 37 residents were questioned systematically, with particular attention paid to those living directly above the blocked drainage points. Joachim Kroll's third-floor apartment was among the first investigated. When he answered his door, Schultz was struck by the man's apparent calm. No nervousness, no evasive behavior, just mild curiosity about the plumbing problems affecting the building. Kroll readily granted permission for officers to examine his apartment, even offering to assist in any way possible. The apartment itself was a study in meticulous organization. Every surface was clean, every object precisely placed. The walls were lined with shelves containing hundreds of rubber dolls in various sizes and conditions, arranged with military precision. When questioned about this unusual collection, Kroll explained matter-of-factly that they were companions who provided comfort during his lonely evenings. It was Detective Sergeant Klaus Möller who noticed the unusual contents of a pot simmering on the apartment's small stove. When he lifted the lid, the smell that emerged was unlike anything in his experience, sweet, organic, but fundamentally wrong. The contents appeared to be a stew containing carrots, potatoes, and what looked like cuts of meat, though the texture and colour seemed inconsistent with any known animal protein. "What are you cooking, Herr Kroll?" Müller asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Joachim looked up from the newspaper he was reading, seemingly puzzled by the question. "Dinner," he replied simply. "I'm having my neighbour for dinner." The casual nature of this admission, delivered without apparent recognition of its horrifying implications, would become legendary in German criminal justice circles. Even hardened investigators were stunned by Kroll's matter-of-fact tone, as if he were discussing the weather rather than confessing to cannibalism. Further investigation of the apartment revealed a charnel house hidden behind suburban normalcy. The refrigerator contained carefully wrapped packages of human flesh, labelled and dated with the same precision Kroll applied to his doll collection. Kitchen knives showed microscopic traces of human blood and tissue. Most damning was a collection of plastic bags containing clothing, jewellery, and personal effects from numerous victims, each meticulously catalogued and preserved as trophies. The victim whose remains were being prepared for Kroll's dinner was soon identified as 4-year-old Marion Ketter, who had disappeared from a Duisburg playground on July 3rd, evening while her mother briefly visited a nearby shop. Security camera footage from a local business showed Kroll approaching the child and leading her away, though the grainy image quality had initially made identification impossible. Under interrogation, Joachim demonstrated the same disturbing calm that had characterized his initial contact with police. He readily admitted to Marion's murder, providing details that could only have come from the perpetrator. But when pressed about other crimes, he claimed memory problems, suggesting that the various murders had blended together in his mind like scenes from different movies. Dr. Georg Stumm, the court-appointed psychiatrist who evaluated Kroll, described him as one of the most psychologically complex subjects he had encountered. The man showed no obvious signs of psychosis or disconnection from reality. He understood the difference between right and wrong, could articulate social norms and legal boundaries, yet seemed utterly incapable of applying these concepts to his own behaviour. He discussed his crimes with the same emotional detachment that most people would use to describe their grocery shopping, Dr. Stumm wrote in his evaluation. There was no evidence of remorse, guilt, or even recognition that his victims had been human beings with their own thoughts, feelings, and right to exist. They were simply objects that had served his psychological needs. The forensic evidence that emerged during the investigation was overwhelming. Human remains found in Kroll's apartment were matched through dental records and personal effects to at least 8 victims spanning 2 decades. Hair and fibre evidence linked him to crime scenes across North Rhine-Westphalia. Most crucially, his detailed confessions contained information about victim injuries and crime scene details that had never been released to the public. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was Kroll's meticulously maintained diary, written in his neat handwriting and documenting not just his crimes, but his psychological evolution over 2 decades. The entries revealed a man who viewed his killings as experiments, carefully noting what techniques were most effective, which victim types provided the greatest satisfaction, how to avoid detection by authorities. "Today I found a perfect one," read an entry from September 1967. "Small, trusting, alone." The procedure went smoothly. No complications with disposal. The meat was very tender. I must remember this preparation method for future applications. The clinical language reflected Kroll's fundamental inability to recognize his victims' humanity. They were reduced to objects in his psychological universe, valuable only for the services they provided to his pathological needs. This dehumanization had enabled him to continue killing for over 2 decades without apparent psychological conflict. The trial of Joachim Kroll began on October 4, 1979, in Duisburg District Court. Presiding Judge Heinrich Janssen faced the challenge of processing evidence from 14 confirmed murders and numerous other crimes spanning 24 years. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Franz Weber, presented a methodical case built on forensic evidence, victim identification, and Kroll's own detailed confessions. Defense attorney Manfred Köhler faced an impossible task. His client had confessed to horrific crimes with extensive corroborating evidence. The only viable strategy was arguing diminished capacity due to mental illness, though Kroll's demonstrated ability to plan and execute crimes over decades suggested legal sanity under German law. The courtroom was packed throughout the proceedings, with journalists from across Europe covering what many considered the most significant German criminal trial since the Nuremberg proceedings. Public fascination with the case reflected deeper anxieties about social order and the possibility that monsters could live undetected within ordinary communities for decades. Testimony from surviving family members provided devastating emotional counterpoint to the clinical forensic evidence. Parents described the ongoing anguish of losing children to inexplicable violence, the decades of not knowing what had happened, the relief mixed with horror upon finally learning the truth. Many spoke of survivor guilt, wondering whether they could have done something different to protect their loved ones. Dr. Stumm's psychiatric testimony proved crucial to understanding Kroll's pathology. He explained how childhood trauma and developmental disorders had combined to create a person fundamentally incapable of normal human empathy. However, he emphasized that mental illness did not equal legal insanity. Kroll understood his actions were wrong and took elaborate precautions to avoid detection, demonstrating criminal responsibility. The most disturbing aspect of the testimony was Kroll's own matter-of-fact descriptions of his crimes. When asked why he had killed so many people, he replied simply that he needed to. When pressed about the cannibalism, he explained that it made the victims part of him forever and prevented them from going away like everyone else had. On April 8, 1982, after deliberating for 6 hours, the jury found Joachim Kroll guilty on 8 counts of murder. 6 other cases could not be prosecuted due to statute of limitations issues. Judge Janssen sentenced him to 9 terms of life imprisonment, declaring that Kroll represented a danger to society that cannot be mitigated through rehabilitation or treatment. The sentence ensured that Kroll would never again walk free, but it could not address the broader questions his crimes had raised about social isolation, mental health services, and law enforcement coordination. His ability to kill undetected for over 2 decades exposed systematic failures in multiple institutions designed to protect public safety. Joachim Kroll was transferred to Rheinbach prison, where he would spend the remaining 9 years of his life. Prison officials described him as a model inmate, quiet, compliant, causing no disciplinary problems. He spent his time reading, maintaining correspondence with a few distant relatives, and caring for his collection of rubber dolls, which prison authorities allowed him to keep as they posed no security risk. He showed no interest in appeals or legal challenges to his conviction. When asked by a prison psychologist whether he felt remorse for his crimes, Kroll replied that he felt sorry that people were upset, but didn't understand why his actions had caused such strong reactions. He compared the public response to his crimes to people being angry about natural disasters or accidents that couldn't be prevented. On July 1st, 1991, Joachim Kroll died of a heart attack while alone in his cell. He was 58 years old and had served barely 9 years of his life sentences. Prison guards found him lying peacefully on his narrow bed, surrounded by his rubber dolls, clutching a faded photograph of his childhood home in Silesia. The final tragedy was that even in death, Joachim Kroll revealed nothing about the psychological mechanisms that had transformed a lonely child into one of Germany's most prolific serial killers. His crimes remained as inexplicable as they were horrific, a reminder that some forms of human evil resist rational understanding or meaningful explanation. The Kroll case prompted significant reforms in German law enforcement, including improved interjurisdictional communication, centralized databases for tracking serial crimes, and enhanced training in behavioral analysis. But these systemic improvements could not resurrect his victims or heal the communities he had terrorized for more than 2 decades. In the end, Joachim Kroll's legacy was not the infamy he achieved through his crimes, but the innocent lives he destroyed and the families left to grapple with unimaginable loss. His story serves as a sobering reminder that monsters often hide behind masks of mundane normality, that evil can flourish in society's shadows, and that vigilance, both individual and institutional, remains our best defense against those who would prey upon the vulnerable and innocent. The industrial fog still hangs over Duisburg on grey mornings, carrying the same smells of coal and steel that defined Joachim Kroll's world. But the city has moved forward, its residents determined not to be defined by one man's monstrous acts. In parks where children play, on streets where people walk alone after dark, in the simple acts of daily life that require basic trust in human decency, the community has chosen hope over fear, connection over isolation. It is perhaps the most fitting memorial to those whose lives were cut short. Not monuments or plaques, but the persistent, courageous decision to continue living fully in the face of inexplicable evil. In their memory, ordinary people perform extraordinary acts of faith every day, trusting that most of their neighbours are exactly what they appear to be, fellow human beings struggling with life's challenges, seeking connection and meaning, deserving of compassion and respect. Joachim Kroll destroyed that trust for many, but he could not destroy the human capacity to rebuild it, one relationship at a time, one community at a time, one generation at a time. That, ultimately, may be the most important lesson from his terrible story. Not that monsters exist among us, but that goodness persists despite them, and that our shared humanity remains stronger than any individual's capacity for evil. The container. The steel shipping container sat rusted and forgotten in the dense woods of Woodruff, South Carolina, its corrugated walls concealing horrors that would take 13 years to surface. Inside, Carla Brown's voice cracked as she screamed for help, her words echoing off the metal walls, that had become her prison. It was November 3rd, 2016, and her boyfriend, Charlie Carver, had been missing for 2 months. What deputies would discover that day would unravel one of the most chilling crime sprees in South Carolina history, spanning over a decade and claiming 7 lives. The man responsible had been hiding in plain sight, a successful real estate agent with a sprawling 95-acre property, a man who had learned to manipulate, control, and kill with calculated precision. Todd Christopher Kohlhepp had spent years perfecting his public façade, while privately orchestrating a reign of terror that began long before anyone suspected the monster lurking beneath his professional veneer. Born on March 7th, 1971, in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, Todd Christopher Samsel entered a world already fractured by dysfunction. His parents, William Samsel and Regina Tague, divorced when Todd was just 2 years old, setting the stage for a childhood marked by instability and rage. His mother remarried Carl Kohlhepp, whose surname Todd would eventually adopt, but the new family structure brought little peace to a boy already showing disturbing signs of violence and control. By age 9, Todd was destroying property and threatening other children with knives. His mother, overwhelmed and frightened, sent him to live with his biological father in Arizona, hoping distance might provide the structure her son desperately needed. Instead, it only provided new opportunities for his growing pathology to manifest. At age 15, on August 30th, 1986, Todd committed the crime that would first mark him as a predator: the kidnapping and sexual assault of a 14-year-old neighbor in Tempe, Arizona. The assault was not impulsive, but calculated. Todd had lured the girl to his father's home with promises of watching movies, then bound her with rope and duct tape before sexually assaulting her at gunpoint. The methodical nature of the crime, the planning involved, and his complete lack of remorse afterward painted a portrait of a sociopathic teenager who viewed other human beings as objects for his gratification. When arrested, Todd showed no emotion, no regret, only anger at being caught. The Arizona juvenile justice system sentenced him as an adult, and he would spend the next 14 years in prison, a period that should have served as rehabilitation, but instead became his graduate education in manipulation and violence. Fellow inmates later described him as calculating and intelligent, someone who studied human psychology not to heal, but to better exploit weaknesses in others. He earned his GED and even took college courses, all while nursing fantasies of revenge against a world he believed had wronged him. Released on parole in 2001 at age 30, Todd moved to South Carolina, where his mother had relocated. The state's less stringent sex offender registration requirements and his clean record since his juvenile conviction made it easier for him to blend into society. He changed his name legally to Todd Christopher Kohlhepp, distancing himself from his criminal past, and began building the life that would serve as his cover for the next 15 years. By 2003, Todd had established himself as a licensed real estate agent in the Spartanburg area, using his intelligence and superficial charm to build a successful business. His colleagues described him as intense but professional, someone who worked long hours and seemed driven to succeed. What they didn't know was that success, for Todd, wasn't measured in commission checks. It was measured in control, dominance, and the power to decide who lived and who died. The first sign that Todd Kohlhepp the businessman was also Todd Kohlhepp the killer came on November 6, 2003, at Superbike Motorsports in Chesney, South Carolina. The motorcycle dealership, nestled in a strip mall along Highway 11, was known throughout the region for its quality bikes and expert service. Owner Scott Ponder had built the business from the ground up, earning a reputation for honest dealing and mechanical expertise. On that grey November morning, 4 people were going about their normal routines, unaware that a customer with a grudge was about to turn their workplace into a slaughter ground. Scott Ponder, 30, was the heart of Superbike Motorsports. A devoted father and husband, he had poured his passion for motorcycles into building a business that served riders throughout the Carolinas. Brian Lucas, 30, worked as the shop's mechanic, his hands perpetually stained with oil and his mind focused on the intricate details of motorcycle engines. Beverly Guy, 52, served as the bookkeeper, her warm personality making customers feel welcome the moment they walked through the door. Chris Sherbert, 26, was the newest employee, eager to learn the trade and build a future in the motorcycle industry. None of them recognized the danger when Todd Kohlhepp walked through their door that morning, carrying a concealed weapon and nursing a grievance over a motorcycle purchase that had gone wrong months earlier. Witnesses later testified that Todd had been dissatisfied with a bike he'd purchased from the shop, claiming mechanical problems and demanding compensation that Scott Ponder had refused to provide. For most people, such a dispute would result in a bad review or a complaint to the Better Business Bureau. For Todd, it became a death sentence for 4 innocent people. The murders were swift and brutal. Todd systematically executed each person in the shop, moving from room to room with the methodical precision of someone who had planned every detail. Scott Ponder was found behind the counter, Beverly Guy near the front desk, while Brian Lucas and Chris Sherbert were discovered in the service area. Each victim had been shot multiple times, the wounds suggesting Todd had taken time to ensure they were dead before moving to the next target. The Spartanburg County Sheriff's Office arrived to find a scene that would haunt investigators for years. Blood spattered the walls and floor, and the 4 bodies lay where they had fallen, their lives cut short by a customer's twisted sense of entitlement. Detective Charles Blackwood, who worked the case from the beginning, later described it as one of the most senseless crimes he had ever encountered. 4 people killed over what amounted to a business dispute. The investigation that followed consumed thousands of hours and countless resources. Detectives interviewed customers, suppliers, competitors, and anyone who might have had contact with the victims in the days leading up to the murders. They analysed financial records, reviewed security footage from nearby businesses, and followed up on hundreds of tips from the public. Todd Kohlhepp's name appeared in their files as a customer who had purchased a motorcycle from the shop, but he was questioned briefly and dismissed as a suspect when he provided what appeared to be a solid alibi. For 13 years, the Superbike Motorsports murders remained unsolved, a cold case that continued to torment the families of the victims and the investigators who had worked tirelessly to find answers. The families held annual memorial services, keeping their loved ones' memories alive, while hoping that someday, somehow, justice would be served. Detective Blackwood never stopped working the case, revisiting evidence and following new leads, even as other cases demanded his attention. Meanwhile, Todd Kohlhepp continued building his public persona as a successful real estate agent. He purchased the 95-acre property in Woodruff, South Carolina in 2013, telling neighbors and colleagues that he wanted privacy and space to enjoy outdoor activities. The property, accessed by a long gravel road and hidden from public view by dense forest, became his private kingdom where he could indulge his darkest fantasies without fear of discovery. The land itself seemed to mirror Todd's fractured psyche, beautiful on the surface, but concealing dangerous secrets beneath. Rolling hills covered in pine and hardwood gave way to hidden clearings where he would eventually bury his victims. An old barn provided storage for his tools of murder, while the shipping container he had placed near the main house would become a torture chamber designed to keep victims alive for as long as he desired their suffering. It was on this property that Todd's killing would resume, though the exact timeline of his crimes between 2003 and 2016 may never be fully known. What investigators do know is that he used his real estate connections and online presence to identify and lure victims, particularly those involved in motorcycle sales or other interests that connected to his Superbike Motorsports grudge. Johnny Joe Coxey, a mechanic and motorcycle enthusiast, became one of Todd's victims during this period, though his body would not be discovered until after Todd's arrest. Megan Lee McCraw-Coxey, Johnny's wife, also fell victim to Todd's methodical killing spree. The couple had been reported missing by concerned family members, but without bodies or clear evidence of foul play, their disappearances were treated as missing persons cases rather than homicides. Todd had learned from his previous crimes, becoming more careful about body disposal and evidence elimination. He buried victims on his property in locations he marked with GPS coordinates, treating human remains like inventory in a macabre warehouse. His real estate background gave him knowledge of land surveying and property boundaries that he used to ensure the graves would remain undiscovered. The psychological profile that would later emerge painted a picture of a man who killed not for passion or impulse, but for the sense of ultimate control it provided. Todd viewed his victims as problems to be solved, obstacles to be removed, or simply objects for his entertainment. His writings, discovered after his arrest, revealed a mind that had completely dehumanized other people, reducing them to tools for his gratification or targets for his rage. By 2016, Todd had perfected his methods and grown bolder in his selection of victims. It was then that he encountered Carla Brown and Charlie Carver, a young couple whose connection to motorcycles and Todd's property would seal their fate. Carla, 29, worked as a house cleaner, while Charlie, 32, did odd jobs, including landscaping and maintenance work. They had been hired to help with cleanup on Todd's property, a job that seemed routine but would become a nightmare beyond imagination. On August 31st, 2016, Carla and Charlie arrived at Todd's Woodruff property to begin work. Todd had likely planned their capture for days or weeks, studying their routines and determining how best to isolate them from potential help. The property's remote location made it perfect for his purposes. Screams would not be heard, and visitors were unlikely to arrive unexpectedly. Charlie Carver was killed almost immediately, shot and buried on the property in a grave Todd had prepared in advance. For Carla Brown, however, Todd had different plans. He chained her inside the shipping container he had modified for long-term imprisonment, beginning a 2-month ordeal that would test the limits of human endurance and survival. The container, measuring approximately 8 feet by 20 feet, had been outfitted with basic necessities designed to keep a victim alive but miserable. A bucket served as a toilet, while a thin mattress provided minimal comfort on the steel floor. Todd had installed a small ventilation system and electrical lighting, creating an environment where someone could survive for extended periods while remaining completely at his mercy. For 65 days, Kayla endured unspeakable horrors as Todd visited her regularly to rape, torture, and psychologically torment her. He would bring food and water, ensuring her survival while simultaneously breaking down her will to resist. His journal entries from this period, discovered later by investigators, revealed the depth of his sadistic pleasure in controlling another human being completely. The community began searching for the missing couple within days of their disappearance. Kayla's family organized search parties, distributed flyers, and contacted local media outlets to publicize their loved one's disappearance. Charlie's friends and family did the same, and soon the search for the couple had gained regional attention. Missing persons posters appeared throughout Spartanburg and surrounding counties, showing the faces of 2 people whose fate remained unknown to all but their captor. Local law enforcement took the disappearance seriously, particularly given the couple's stable lives and close family relationships. Missing persons investigations revealed that Carla and Charlie had last been seen heading to a cleaning job, but the location of that job remained unclear. Family members knew they had been doing work for various clients, but specific details about their August 31st appointment were frustratingly vague. Todd, meanwhile, continued his normal routine of showing properties and conducting real estate business, even as he held Carla captive just miles from his office. His ability to compartmentalize his criminal activities while maintaining his professional façade demonstrated the sophisticated sociopathic personality that had allowed him to evade detection for over a decade. The break in the case came through digital forensics rather than traditional detective work. Investigators analysing Kayla Brown's cell phone records discovered that her device had last pinged near Todd's Woodruff property on the day she disappeared. The connection seemed tenuous. Todd was a real estate agent who might legitimately have properties in that area, but it provided the first solid lead in the investigation. Detective Joey Foster of the Spartanburg County Sheriff's Office began researching Todd's background and property holdings. What he discovered raised immediate red flags. Todd was a registered sex offender with a history of violent crime, and his property in Woodruff was isolated and large enough to conceal almost anything. More importantly, computer records showed that Carla had indeed been hired to do cleaning work at Todd's property on the day she disappeared. On November 3, 2016, deputies arrived at Todd's property with a search warrant, expecting to find evidence of the missing couple, but unsure what form that evidence might take. The property's size and dense vegetation made a thorough search challenging, but deputies were systematic in their approach, working outward from the main house in expanding circles. It was Deputy Chad Brooks who first heard the banging and muffled screams coming from the shipping container. The sound was faint, but unmistakably human, and as deputies approached the container, the sounds grew more frantic. When they cut the locks and opened the door, they found Kayla Brown chained inside, alive but traumatized beyond description. The rescue of Carla Brown made national headlines, but for investigators, it was just the beginning of uncovering the full scope of Todd's crimes. Carla's initial statements to police were limited by her trauma and physical condition. She was severely dehydrated, malnourished, and suffering from infections caused by her prolonged captivity. However, she was able to confirm that Charlie Carver had been killed, and that Todd had been holding her prisoner for over 2 months. Todd was arrested immediately and charged with kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder. His calm demeanor during the arrest struck investigators as particularly chilling. He showed no emotion, no surprise, and no remorse. When read his rights, he simply asked for an attorney and refused to make any statements about his crimes. The search of Todd's property revealed a horror show that exceeded investigators' worst expectations. Using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, they located multiple burial sites scattered across the 95 acres. Each grave was precisely marked with GPS coordinates in Todd's records, demonstrating the methodical nature of his killings and body disposal. Charlie Carver's body was found buried in a shallow grave near the container where Kayla had been held. Forensic examination revealed he had been shot once in the chest, a wound that would have caused rapid death. The location of the grave, within sight of the container, suggested Todd may have forced Kayla to watch the burial, or at least been aware of her boyfriend's fate throughout her captivity. Johnny Joe Coxey and Megan Lee McCraw Coxey were found buried together in a remote section of the property, their bodies wrapped in plastic and buried beneath several feet of dirt and debris. Forensic analysis indicated they had been killed months or possibly years earlier, their disappearance having gone unnoticed because of their transient lifestyle and limited family connections. The discovery of the bodies confirmed what investigators had suspected. Todd's killing spree had been far more extensive than anyone had imagined. The methodical burial process, the GPS marking system, and the careful selection of burial sites all pointed to a serial killer who had been operating undetected for years. As investigators continued processing the crime scene, Todd's defense attorneys began crafting a strategy that would acknowledge their client's guilt while attempting to avoid the death penalty. South Carolina law allowed for capital punishment in cases involving multiple murders, kidnapping, and sexual assault, making Todd a prime candidate for execution if convicted. The psychological evaluation of Todd, conducted by court-appointed experts, revealed a complex personality disorder characterized by narcissistic and antisocial traits. Dr. James Ballinger, a forensic psychiatrist who examined Todd, described him as having no capacity for empathy or remorse, viewing other people as objects to be manipulated or eliminated based on his perceived needs or desires. Todd's journals and computer files, seized during the property search, provided disturbing insights into his mindset and methods. He had maintained detailed records of his victims, including photographs, personal information, and what appeared to be trophies taken from crime scenes. The documents revealed a man who took pride in his ability to kill without detection, and who viewed each murder as an achievement to be celebrated, rather than a tragedy to be mourned. The superbike motorsports connection was confirmed through ballistics evidence found on Todd's property. The .45 caliber handgun used in the 2003 murders was discovered hidden in the barn, along with ammunition and other weapons. Forensic testing confirmed that the bullets that killed Scott Ponder, Beverly Guy, Brian Lucas, and Chris Sherbert had been fired from Todd's weapon, finally solving the cold case that had haunted investigators for 13 years. The revelation that Todd had been responsible for the superbike murders sent shockwaves through the Spartanburg community. Families, who had waited over a decade for answers, finally had closure, though the knowledge that their loved one's killer had been free for so long brought little comfort. Scott Ponder's widow, Melissa, told reporters that while she was grateful for the resolution, the years of uncertainty and pain could never be undone. As the investigation expanded, law enforcement agencies across the Southeast began reviewing unsolved cases that might be connected to Todd's travel patterns and known activities. His real estate work had taken him throughout South Carolina and into neighboring states, and his method of targeting victims connected to motorcycles or outdoor activities suggested there might be additional crimes that had gone undetected. The forensic examination of Todd's property continued for months, with investigators using increasingly sophisticated technology to search for additional burial sites. The property's size and the density of the vegetation made the search challenging, but the systematic approach eventually revealed the full scope of the carnage. In addition to the confirmed murder victims, investigators found evidence of other violent crimes, including what appeared to be torture implements and restraint devices that suggested additional victims who might have been killed elsewhere. Todd's trial began in May 2017, with prosecutors seeking the death penalty for the multiple murders, kidnapping, and sexual assault charges. The case against him was overwhelming. Physical evidence, witness testimony, and his own recorded confessions to police painted a picture of a remorseless killer who had terrorized the community for over a decade. The prosecution's case was methodical and comprehensive, presenting evidence from each crime scene while weaving together the common threads that connected all of Todd's victims. Lead prosecutor Barry Barnett described Todd as a predator who had used his intelligence and social position to identify and isolate victims, then killed them with the same cold calculation he might use to close a real estate transaction. Defense attorneys focused their efforts on avoiding the death penalty rather than disputing Todd's guilt. They presented evidence of his troubled childhood and the abuse he had suffered, arguing that while his crimes were inexcusable, his background provided context for understanding how he had become a killer. Mental health experts testified about the profound psychological damage that can result from childhood trauma and sexual abuse, though they acknowledged that millions of people experience similar trauma without becoming murderers. Carla Brown's testimony was the emotional centerpiece of the trial. Her account of the 65 days she spent chained in the shipping container was harrowing in its detail and devastating in its impact on the jury. She described the daily sexual assaults, the psychological torture, and the constant fear that each day might be her last. Her survival, she testified, was due to her determination to see her family again, and her refusal to give Todd the satisfaction of breaking her spirit completely. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. The speed of their decision reflected the overwhelming evidence against Todd and the heinous nature of his crimes. When the verdict was read, Todd showed no emotion, staring straight ahead, as if the proceedings were merely an inconvenience rather than a judgment on his life and crimes. The penalty phase of the trial focused on the question of whether Todd should be sentenced to death or life in prison without parole. Prosecutors argued that the calculated nature of his crimes, the suffering he had inflicted on his victims, and the danger he would always pose to society demanded the ultimate punishment. Defense attorneys countered with evidence of Todd's mental illness and childhood trauma, arguing that life imprisonment would serve justice while avoiding the moral complexity of state-sanctioned execution. On November 15, 2017, the jury recommended a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole for each of the 7 murders, ensuring that Todd would never again walk free. The decision to spare his life was controversial in a community that had suffered so much at his hands, but it reflected the jury's careful consideration of all the evidence and their ultimate conclusion that life imprisonment would serve justice without requiring the state to take another life. Judge Roger Couch accepted the jury's recommendation and formally sentenced Todd to 7 consecutive life sentences without parole. In delivering the sentence, Judge Couch described Todd's crimes as among the most heinous he had encountered in over 2 decades on the bench, noting that the calculated nature of the murders and the suffering inflicted on victims and their families demanded the harshest punishment available under the law. Todd was transferred to the Ruhr Ripper Correctional Institution, where he remains in maximum security custody. Prison officials describe him as a model inmate who follows rules and causes no trouble, though they note that his compliance likely reflects his understanding that good behavior might eventually provide him with privileges rather than any genuine rehabilitation or remorse. The investigation into Todd's crimes officially concluded in 2018, though law enforcement agencies continue to review cold cases that might be connected to his activities. The final forensic report confirmed 7 victims across 2 distinct time periods. The 4 Superbike Motorsports employees killed in 2003 and the 3 victims killed between 2015 and 2016. While investigators suspect there may have been additional victims, no conclusive evidence has been found to support charges for other crimes. The impact of Todd's crimes extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The Superbike Motorsports murders had terrorized the local motorcycle community for over a decade, leading many riders to alter their routines and avoid certain areas out of fear that they might be targeted. The resolution of the case brought closure to that community, though the knowledge that the killer had been operating among them for so long remained deeply unsettling. Carla Brown's survival and recovery became a testament to human resilience in the face of unimaginable trauma. Her decision to testify at Todd's trial, despite the emotional cost, provided crucial evidence for his conviction and demonstrated remarkable courage. She has since become an advocate for victims of violent crime, using her experience to help others who have survived similar ordeals. The families of Todd's victims have worked to ensure that their loved ones are remembered for their lives rather than their deaths. The Ponder family established a scholarship fund in Scott's memory, supporting students interested in motorcycle mechanics and small business entrepreneurship. Beverly Guy's family created a memorial garden at their local church, while the families of Brian Lucas and Chris Sherbert have organized annual motorcycle rides to raise money for victims' rights organizations. The case has been studied by criminal justice experts and behavioral analysts seeking to understand how a serial killer can operate undetected for such an extended period. Todd's ability to maintain a successful professional life while committing horrific crimes challenges assumptions about how predators behave and suggests the need for more sophisticated approaches to identifying and apprehending serial offenders. Law enforcement agencies have implemented new protocols for investigating missing persons cases, particularly those involving couples or individuals who disappear while conducting business with unknown clients. The digital forensics techniques that led to Todd's property being searched have been refined and expanded, providing investigators with better tools for tracking victims' final movements and identifying potential crime scenes. The shipping container where Carla Brown was held captive has been destroyed, but its memory serves as a reminder of the depths of human cruelty and the importance of never giving up hope. Her survival against overwhelming odds demonstrated that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit can endure and ultimately triumph over evil. Todd Kohlhepp remains in prison, where he will spend the rest of his life paying for crimes that shattered multiple families and terrorized an entire community. His case serves as a sobering reminder that monsters can hide behind successful facades, that evil can masquerade as respectability, and that the price of vigilance is constant awareness of the darkness that can lurk in seemingly ordinary people. The steel container that once held Carla Brown prisoner has been reduced to scrap metal, but the courage she showed in surviving those 65 days of hell continues to inspire others. Her testimony ensured that Todd would never harm another person, and her advocacy work helps other survivors find their voices and reclaim their lives from those who tried to destroy them. On May 26, 2017, rather than face a capital trial, Kohlhepp pleaded guilty to 7 counts of murder, 2 counts of kidnapping, and an array of sexual assault and weapons charges. Judge Roger Couch imposed 7 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole plus 60 additional years. Civil actions followed. In October 2020, survivor Carla Brown won a $6.3 million judgment against Kohlhepp's estate, ensuring that any future earnings or assets are directed to the victims' families. In the end, Todd Kohlhepp's story is not just about one man's descent into evil. It's about the resilience of the human spirit, the dedication of law enforcement officers who never gave up on cold cases, and the communities that came together to support victims' families through their darkest hours. The container may be gone, but the memories of those who died and the strength of those who survived ensure that this chapter of horror will never be forgotten, and that justice, however delayed, will always find its way to those who think they can escape it. The Bicycle Predator. The Dark Journey of Sergei Tkachev. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Ryazan's Pervomaisky district like a shroud, creating an ethereal backdrop that would haunt the memories of those who lived through the terror. It was October 15th, 1998, when 9-year-old Anya Volkov left her grandmother's apartment building, her small pink backpack bouncing against her shoulders as she hurried toward the local market to buy bread. The autumn air carried the scent of dying leaves and industrial exhaust from the nearby factories that had defined this working-class neighborhood for decades. What Anya couldn't know, as she navigated the network of bicycle paths that connected Ryazan's residential complexes, was that she had entered the hunting ground of one of Russia's most methodical and disturbing serial killers. Sergei Nikolaevich Tkachev had been watching her for weeks. In the cramped evidence room of the Ryazan Regional Police Department, investigators would later discover 17 black composition notebooks, their pages filled with meticulous handwriting that detailed the daily routines, habits and movements of dozens of young girls. The diaries, written in Tkachev's precise script, read like a predator's field guide to human prey. Subject A7, he had written about Anya. Leaves building at 8:15 a.m. every Tuesday and Thursday. Takes bicycle path through construction zone. Approximately 47 seconds of isolation between streetlights 15 and 16. The transformation of Sergei Tkachev from an unremarkable bicycle mechanic into one of Russia's most prolific child killers began long before that October morning. Born in 1963 in the industrial city of Tula, roughly 120 kilometers south of Moscow, Tkachev grew up during the final decades of the Soviet Union, when economic stagnation and social decay created fertile ground for psychological dysfunction to flourish unchecked. His childhood was marked by the kind of institutional neglect that characterized many Soviet-era families struggling with alcoholism, domestic violence, and the grinding poverty that came with factory work. Tkachev's father, Nikolai, worked the night shift at a munitions plant, arriving home each morning reeking of industrial chemicals and cheap vodka. His mother, Galina, cleaned offices in government buildings. Her hands perpetually raw from harsh cleaning solvents, and her spirit gradually eroded by years of verbal abuse. The family lived in a kommunalka, a communal apartment shared with 3 other families, where privacy was non-existent and tensions simmered constantly beneath the surface of forced civility. Former neighbors from those years would later describe young Sergei as an eerily quiet child who seemed to observe everything while participating in nothing. He would sit by the window for hours, recalled Vera Maximova, who lived across the courtyard from the Tkachev family, just watching the other children play but never joining them. There was something unsettling about the intensity of his focus, the way he would track their movements, like he was studying them. This pattern of observation and detachment would become Tkachev's defining characteristic. School records from the 1970s show a student of average intelligence who rarely spoke in class, but demonstrated an unusual ability to retain detailed information about his classmates' behaviors and routines. His teachers noted that while Sergei showed no particular academic talent, he possessed an almost photographic memory for seemingly trivial details about the people around him. The first documented sign of Tkachev's developing pathology emerged when he was 14 years old. In the spring of 1977, several families in his neighborhood reported that their daughters were being followed home from school by a boy on a bicycle. The reports were vague and inconsistent, describing a thin teenager who would ride parallel to walking students, maintaining a distance that made identification difficult. When confronted by one father, the boy had simply pedaled away without speaking, disappearing into the maze of apartment complexes that defined Soviet urban planning. Soviet authorities, already overwhelmed by rising crime rates and social unrest, dismissed the reports as the paranoid imaginings of overprotective parents. The concept of stalking as a precursor to violent crime was not well understood in 1970s Russia, where most criminal investigations focused on crimes of passion or property theft, rather than the methodical hunting behaviors that would later define Tkachev's modus operandi. By his 18th birthday, Tkachev had developed the skills that would serve his darker purposes. Mandatory military service in the Soviet army introduced him to surveillance techniques, map reading, and the kind of systematic thinking that military training was designed to instill. His service record from 1981 to 1983 describes a competent but unremarkable soldier who excelled at reconnaissance exercises and showed particular aptitude for what his commanding officer called observational patience. After completing his military service, Tkachev returned to civilian life and found work as a bicycle mechanic in Ryazan, a position that provided him with both legitimate access to the transportation method that would become central to his crimes and intimate knowledge of the city's extensive network of bicycle paths. The job also offered him regular interaction with families bringing their children's bicycles for repair, giving him opportunities to observe potential victims and gather intelligence about their daily routines. The bicycle paths of Ryazan were a Soviet-era innovation designed to encourage environmentally friendly transportation and provide safe routes for children traveling to school. These paths, which connected residential areas to schools, markets, and recreational facilities, were initially seen as a progressive urban planning achievement. However, the paths also created isolated corridors where pedestrians and cyclists could travel with minimal adult supervision, particularly during early morning and late afternoon hours when most adults were at work. Tkachev understood the vulnerability these paths created better than anyone. His job required him to test ride-repaired bicycles along various routes throughout the city, giving him legitimate reasons to be present in areas where children regularly travelled alone. Over time, He developed an encyclopedic knowledge of the path system, including which routes were most isolated, where sight lines were blocked by vegetation or construction, and what times of day offered the greatest opportunities for unobserved contact with potential victims. The first confirmed murder attributed to Tkachev occurred on March 22, 1980. Though investigators would later suspect he had been responsible for at least 3 earlier deaths that were initially classified as accidents or missing person cases. 12-year-old Katya Romanova was found in a drainage ditch beside the bicycle path that connected her school to her apartment complex in Ryazan's Moskovsky district. The crime scene revealed a level of planning and preparation that immediately distinguished it from typical opportunistic crimes. Forensic analysis showed that Katya had been approached from behind while walking her bicycle up a small hill along the path. The killer had used a length of electrical cord to strangle her, applying pressure with such precision that investigators determined he must have studied human anatomy or had prior experience with strangulation techniques. More disturbing were the post-mortem injuries, which suggested the killer had spent considerable time with the body, moving it from the initial attack site to the drainage ditch where it was discovered. Detective Lieutenant Mikhail Petrov, the investigating officer assigned to the Romanova case, would later write in his case notes that the crime scene demonstrated an unusual level of forethought and control. Unlike most crimes against children, which are typically characterized by panic and haste on the part of the perpetrator, Katya's murder showed evidence of careful staging designed to confuse investigators and delay identification of the body. The killer had removed Katya's shoes and placed them neatly beside her body, a detail that would become his signature. He had also taken time to arrange her clothing in a way that suggested respect for the victim, covering her torso with her jacket despite the warm spring weather. These seemingly contradictory elements, combining brutal violence with ritualistic care, would puzzle investigators for years and contribute to their failure to recognize the murders as the work of a single perpetrator. Throughout the early 1980s, similar murders occurred with disturbing regularity across Ryazan and neighboring cities. The victims were always young girls between the ages of 9 and 17, always found near bicycle paths and always bearing the same signature elements: removal and neat placement of shoes, careful arrangement of clothing, and evidence of extended post-mortem contact with the killer. However, the decentralized nature of Soviet law enforcement, combined with jurisdictional disputes between different police departments, prevented investigators from recognizing the pattern. Each murder was investigated as an isolated incident by local authorities who had limited resources and no effective system for sharing information across jurisdictional boundaries. The concept of serial killing was not well understood in Soviet criminology, where violent crime was often attributed to political dissidents, foreign influence, or the social pathology of capitalism, rather than the systematic predation of individuals who had been shaped by the very system they were victimizing. Tkachev's diaries, discovered years later, reveal the methodical nature of his hunting process. Each potential victim was assigned a code number and subjected to weeks or months of surveillance before he decided whether to proceed with an attack. His entries show that he would study victims' routines with scientific precision, noting everything from their preferred routes to school, to their family schedules, to the timing of their parents' work shifts. Subject B12, he wrote about 13-year-old Marina Fedorova in September 1983, deviates from standard route on Wednesdays due to music lessons. Window of opportunity exists between 4:20 and 4:35 p.m. when path crosses industrial area. Weather patterns suggest optimal conditions for approach during the first week of October. Marina's body was found on October 3rd, 1983, exactly as Tkachev had predicted. The psychological profile that would eventually emerge of Tkachev painted the picture of a man who had transformed childhood trauma and social isolation into a systematic approach to murder. Unlike many serial killers who act impulsively or in response to immediate triggers, Tkachev demonstrated what forensic psychologists would later classify as organized predatory behavior, characterized by extensive planning, careful victim selection, and the ability to maintain a normal outward appearance while engaging in horrific crimes. His choice of bicycle paths as hunting grounds was not random, but reflected a sophisticated understanding of both his own capabilities and the vulnerabilities of his chosen victim population. The paths provided him with legitimate reasons to be present in areas where children traveled alone, offered multiple escape routes in case of unexpected interruption, and created natural choke points where victims could be isolated from potential witnesses or assistants. The bicycles themselves served multiple purposes in Tkachev's methodology. They allowed him to cover large distances quickly while scouting for victims, provided a silent means of approach that would not alert targets to his presence, and created a mobile platform from which he could observe potential victims without appearing suspicious. The mechanical knowledge he had gained through his work also allowed him to sabotage victims' bicycles in subtle ways, creating situations where they would be forced to walk along isolated sections of path where they were most vulnerable to attack. By the mid-1980s, Tkachev had refined his methods to such a degree that he was averaging 3 to 4 murders per year while maintaining his civilian identity and even developing what appeared to be normal social relationships. He married Yelena Sokolova in 1985, a woman he had met through his work who knew him as a quiet but reliable man with a steady job and no apparent interest in violence or criminal behavior. Yelena would later tell investigators that her husband was an attentive partner who showed no signs of the rage or instability she had been taught to associate with violent criminals. He helped with household chores, remembered anniversaries and birthdays, and even suggested they start a family together. This ability to compartmentalize his criminal behavior while maintaining normal relationships was one of the factors that allowed Tkachev to continue killing undetected for so many years. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 created new challenges for both Tkachev and the investigators who were unknowingly pursuing him. Economic chaos and the breakdown of established social structures led to a massive increase in crime rates throughout Russia, overwhelming law enforcement agencies that were already struggling with limited resources and outdated investigative techniques. In this environment, the murders of young girls along bicycle paths were often overshadowed by more visible crimes like organized crime violence, economic corruption, and political assassinations. However, the post-Soviet period also brought new investigative tools and techniques to Russian law enforcement. The establishment of the Federal Security Service and the adoption of Western forensic methods began to modernize criminal investigations, creating opportunities for the kind of pattern recognition that had been impossible under the Soviet system. Detective Captain Alexei Volkov, who took over the investigation of what were now being called the bicycle path murders in 1995, was among the first Russian investigators to apply modern serial killer profiling techniques to domestic cases. Working with forensic psychologists from Moscow State University, Volkov began to identify the behavioral patterns that linked murders across multiple jurisdictions and time periods. The breakthrough came in 1997 when advances in DNA analysis allowed investigators to definitively link biological evidence from 12 different crime scenes. The profile that emerged described a killer who was likely employed in a job that gave him legitimate access to bicycle paths, possessed extensive knowledge of local geography, and demonstrated what psychologists termed organized predatory behavior characterized by extensive pre-planning and careful victim selection. The investigation team, now expanded to include specialists from the Federal Security Service, began conducting systematic surveillance of bicycle repair shops, sporting goods stores, and other businesses that would provide their employees with the kind of access and knowledge demonstrated by the killer. This approach eventually led them to Sergei Tkachev, whose employment history, geographical knowledge, and psychological profile matched their suspect description with remarkable precision. The surveillance of Tkachev began in September 1998, just weeks before he would claim what investigators now believe was his final victim. The operation, codenamed Cyclist, involved dozens of officers and required careful coordination to avoid alerting Tkachev to their presence while gathering evidence of his criminal activity. What investigators discovered during this surveillance was perhaps more disturbing than the murders themselves. Tkachev's daily routine involved systematic scouting of potential victims, often spending hours observing young girls as they travelled along bicycle paths to and from school. He carried a small notebook in which he recorded detailed observations about individual targets, creating what amounted to a catalogue of potential victims organised by location, routine, and vulnerability factors. The notebooks revealed the full scope of Tkachev's activities over nearly 2 decades. In addition to the murders that had been definitively linked to him through physical evidence, investigators found detailed notes about more than 200 potential victims, including photographs, maps of their daily routes, and assessments of their accessibility. Many of the girls described in these notes were still alive, having unknowingly avoided becoming victims through changes in routine, family relocations, or simple luck. On November 12, 1998, surveillance officers watched as Tkachev began following 15-year-old Svetlana Nikiforova along the bicycle path that connected her school to her apartment complex in Ryazan's Zheleznodorozhny district. The operation required split-second timing to allow investigators to gather evidence of Tkachev's intent while ensuring Svetlana's safety. As Tkachev approached Svetlana on a section of path that was isolated from main roads by a grove of birch trees, tactical officers moved in to make the arrest. The confrontation was brief and non-violent, with Tkachev offering no resistance when ordered to stop. In his backpack, investigators found lengths of electrical cord identical to those used in previous murders, a knife, and a notebook containing detailed observations about Svetlana's daily routine. The interrogation of Sergei Tkachev lasted for 6 days and revealed the mind of a killer who had transformed systematic observation into methodical murder. Unlike many serial killers who claim to be driven by uncontrollable urges or external voices, Tkachev described his crimes in terms that suggested complete rational control over his actions. He had chosen to become a killer, he explained, because it provided him with a sense of power and control that he had never experienced in any other aspect of his life. His confessions included details about 37 murders committed over 18 years, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in Russian history. The geographical scope of his crimes extended beyond Ryazan to include victims in Tula, Moscow, and several smaller cities, all connected by the bicycle path networks that had provided him with both hunting grounds and escape routes. The psychological evaluation conducted by Dr. Irina Kozlova, a leading expert in criminal psychology at Moscow State University, concluded that Tkachev demonstrated organized antisocial personality disorder with specific paraphilic interests related to control and domination. Unlike killers driven by sexual motivation or psychotic delusions, Tkachev appeared to be motivated primarily by the intellectual challenge of hunting human prey and the psychological satisfaction of exercising absolute control over his victims. The trial of Sergei Tkachev began on March 15, 2000, in the Ryazan Regional Court and attracted national attention as details of his crimes were revealed to the public for the first time. The proceedings were marked by Tkachev's calm demeanour and his apparent lack of remorse for his actions. When asked by the judge whether he felt any guilt about the murders, Tkachev replied that he felt professional satisfaction at having avoided detection for so many years. The families of his victims packed the courtroom each day, many of them learning for the first time that their daughters' deaths were not isolated tragedies, but part of a systematic campaign of predation that had terrorized their communities for nearly 2 decades. The emotional testimony of parents who had spent years wondering whether their children's killers would ever be brought to justice provided a stark contrast to Tkachev's clinical descriptions of his crimes. On July 8, 2000, Sergei Tkachev was sentenced to death for 37 counts of murder, making him eligible for what was then still legal execution by firing squad in the Russian Federation. However, Russia's moratorium on capital punishment, instituted in 1996 as part of the country's application to join the Council of Europe, meant that Tkachev's sentence was automatically commuted to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The case of Sergei Tkachev exposed significant weaknesses in the Soviet and early post-Soviet criminal justice systems that had allowed him to operate undetected for so many years. The lack of communication between different police jurisdictions, the absence of centralized databases for tracking similar crimes, and the limited understanding of serial killer behavior had created an environment where systematic predation could flourish virtually unchecked. In response to these revelations, the Russian government implemented several reforms designed to improve the detection and investigation of serial crimes. The establishment of the Main Information and Analysis Center under the Ministry of Internal Affairs created a centralized database for tracking violent crimes across jurisdictional boundaries, while new training programs introduced Russian investigators to modern profiling techniques and forensic methods. The bicycle paths where Tkachev had hunted his victims underwent significant security improvements, including better lighting, emergency communication systems, and increased police patrols during high-risk hours. Many communities also implemented escort programs that ensured children were accompanied by adults or older siblings when traveling along isolated paths. Sergei Tkachev died in Correctional Colony No. 2nd in the Ryazan region on September 14, 2005, at the age of 42. Prison officials attributed his death to complications from tuberculosis, a common cause of mortality in Russian correctional facilities. His death came just 7 years after his arrest, cutting short what many investigators hoped would be ongoing cooperation in solving additional cold cases that might have been connected to his activities. The notebooks that had documented Tkachev's stalking activities were eventually digitized and analyzed by criminologists studying the behavioral patterns of serial killers. The detailed records he had kept provided unprecedented insight into the mind of a methodical predator and contributed to the development of new investigative techniques for identifying and tracking similar criminals. The legacy of Sergei Tkachev extends far beyond the immediate tragedy of his crimes. His case represented a turning point in Russian criminal justice, demonstrating both the vulnerabilities that had allowed systematic predation to flourish and the potential for modern investigative techniques to identify and stop serial killers before they could claim additional victims. For the families of his victims, Tkachev's death brought a complex mixture of closure and ongoing pain. Many parents expressed relief that he could never harm another child, while others felt cheated of the opportunity to confront him directly about the impact his crimes had had on their lives. The bicycle paths where their daughters had died became informal memorials, marked by flowers and photographs that served as reminders of lives cut short by one man's methodical evil. The story of Sergei Tkachev serves as a chilling reminder that evil often wears an ordinary face and operates through systematic planning rather than impulsive violence. His ability to maintain a normal outward appearance while methodically hunting and killing children demonstrates the importance of recognizing behavioral patterns and maintaining vigilance in protecting the most vulnerable members of society. In the files of the Ryazan Regional Police Department, the case of Sergei Tkachev remains active, with investigators continuing to review unsolved murders from the 1980s and 1990s that might be connected to his activities. The notebooks he left behind continue to provide insights into the mind of a killer whose methodical approach to murder represented one of the most disturbing chapters in the history of Russian criminal justice. The bicycle paths of Ryazan still carry their daily traffic of students, workers, and families, but they now serve as more than mere transportation corridors. They stand as testament to the resilience of communities that refuse to be terrorized into abandoning their daily routines, and as memorials to the 37 young lives that were lost to one man's systematic campaign of evil. In remembering these victims and understanding the methods of their killer, we honor their memory while working to ensure that such systematic predation can never again operate in the shadows for so many years. The Dark Strangler. The letter arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle on June 2, 1927, written in a careful, almost childlike script that belied its horrifying contents. "I am not insane, but I am made insane by the treatment I have been getting," it read. "I have killed 20 women. I couldn't help myself." The letter was signed simply, "The Gorilla Man." By the time those words reached the newspaper's crime desk, the writer had already claimed his final victim. Earl Leonard Nelson, a man whose very name would become synonymous with a particular brand of terror that stalked boarding houses across America, was already in custody in Canada, his 2-year reign of horror finally at an end. But the story of how a cherubic-faced boy from Philadelphia became one of America's first documented serial killers begins not with that letter, but in the suffocating tenements of the early 1900s, where poverty and violence shaped a mind that would never quite heal. Earl Leonard Ferrell was born on May 12, 1897, in the Germantown section of Philadelphia, to parents whose own demons would cast long shadows over their son's fractured psyche. His mother, Frances, was barely 18 when she gave birth, already showing signs of the mental instability that ran through her family line like a poisonous river. His father, an itinerant labourer whose presence in the household was sporadic at best, provided neither stability nor protection from the chaos that defined their daily existence. The first tragedy struck when Earl was just 10 months old. A syphilitic infection ravaged his young body, leaving him hospitalized for weeks as doctors fought to save his life. The disease, likely contracted from his infected mother, would leave permanent scarring, not just on his small body, but on the developing neural pathways of his brain. Medical records from the Philadelphia Children's Hospital, later examined by alienists trying to understand his crimes, noted unusual scarring around the temporal lobes, areas crucial for impulse control and emotional regulation. But if syphilis planted the seeds of Earl's future pathology, it was trauma that watered them. On a sweltering August afternoon in 1908, 11-year-old Earl was riding in a streetcar with his aunt when disaster struck. The trolley, overcrowded with passengers seeking relief from the heat, derailed at a sharp curve near Broad Street. In the chaos that followed, screaming passengers, twisted metal, the acrid smell of electrical fires, young Earl was thrown against the car's interior with such force that he suffered a severe head injury. Hospital records from Pennsylvania Hospital detail the extent of his injuries: a fractured skull, severe concussion, and what doctors then termed traumatic hysteria. For 3 weeks, Earl drifted in and out of consciousness, his young brain swelling against the confines of his skull. When he finally awakened, those who knew him best noticed immediate changes. The quiet, somewhat withdrawn boy had become something else entirely, prone to violent outbursts, sexual precocity that disturbed even the adults in his rough neighborhood, and an obsessive fascination with religion that bordered on the fanatical. His aunt, Ellen Ferrell, who had taken custody of the boy after his mother's complete mental breakdown, documented these changes in letters to social workers that would later become crucial evidence in understanding his psychological development. "The boy ain't right since the accident," she wrote in her unschooled hand. "He talks to Jesus like he's standing right there in the room. And the things he does to himself, it ain't natural for a child." What Ellen couldn't articulate, but what modern forensic psychiatrists would later identify from the case files, were the early signs of what would become a devastating combination of temporal lobe epilepsy sexual dysfunction, and religious mania. The head injury had damaged specific areas of Earl's brain responsible for sexual behavior and impulse control, while the childhood syphilis had created a neurological foundation already primed for pathological development. By age 14, Earl's behavior had become increasingly erratic and dangerous. School records from William Penn High School document a pattern of truancy, sexual misconduct with female classmates, and violent confrontations with male peers. His grades, which had been average before the accident, plummeted as his ability to concentrate deteriorated. Teachers described him as a student who would sit perfectly still for hours, staring into space with what one instructor called the most unsettling smile I have ever seen on a child's face. The religious obsession that had begun in the hospital continued to intensify. Earl would spend hours reading biblical passages aloud, focusing particularly on stories of divine punishment and sexual transgression. He began carrying multiple copies of the Bible, annotating them with increasingly disturbing marginalia that combined religious fervor with sexual imagery. When Ellen tried to intervene, removing some of his religious materials, Earl's response was swift and terrifying. He attacked her with a kitchen knife, stopping only when neighbors, drawn by her screams, broke down the door. The incident led to Earl's first institutionalization at the Philadelphia State Hospital for the Insane, where he would spend the next 2 years. Hospital records meticulously maintained by Dr. Augustus Hoffmann detail a patient whose presentation confounded even experienced alienists. During periods of lucidity, Earl could be charming, articulate, and seemingly remorseful for his actions. He would quote scripture with impressive accuracy, discuss philosophical concepts with remarkable insight for someone his age, and express what appeared to be genuine concern for the welfare of other patients. But these periods were punctuated by episodes of such bizarre and violent behavior that staff members began to fear for their safety. During one documented incident in March 1913, Earl was found in the hospital chapel, having stripped naked and covered himself in what he claimed was the blood of Christ, but which investigation revealed to be his own blood, drawn by systematic self-mutilation with a piece of broken glass. When confronted by orderlies, he delivered what witnesses described as a sermon about the necessity of physical suffering for spiritual redemption, his wounds still bleeding as he spoke. Dr. Hoffmann's notes from this period provide crucial insight into the developing pathology that would later claim 22 lives. Patient exhibits pronounced dissociative episodes during which he assumes the persona of various biblical figures, Hoffmann wrote. Of particular concern is his identification with the story of Lot and his daughters, which he interprets as divine sanction for sexual transgression. Patients' sexual ideation is increasingly fixated on themes of dominance, death, and religious ecstasy. Perhaps most disturbing were Hoffmann's observations about Earl's relationship with death. The young patient showed no normal fear response to mortality. Instead, he seemed fascinated by the concept of what he called the ultimate surrender. When another patient died of pneumonia, Earl was found in the deceased man's bed, having somehow gained access to the body. He claimed he was learning from the departed soul and showed no understanding of why staff found his behavior inappropriate. In 1915, at age 18, Earl was released from the hospital despite Dr. Hoffmann's strong reservations. The decision was driven more by overcrowding and budget constraints than by any improvement in his condition. His discharge notes contained a prophetic warning. Patient remains a significant danger to society, particularly to women. His combination of religious mania, sexual pathology, and dissociative episodes creates a profile of extreme concern. Recommend continued supervision and immediate reinstitutionalization at first sign of decompensation. No such supervision materialized. Earl disappeared into the urban anonymity of Philadelphia's slums, where young men with questionable pasts could easily reinvent themselves. For the next several years, his life becomes a patchwork of contradictions and disturbing incidents that, viewed in retrospect, formed a clear trajectory towards serial murder. He found work as a hospital orderly, a position that provided him with access to vulnerable patients and ample opportunity to observe human suffering and death. Hospital staff at Pennsylvania Hospital later recalled a young man who was conscientious in his duties, but whose bedside manner made patients uncomfortable. There was something about the way he looked at the female patients, one nurse remembered years later, like he was seeing something the rest of us couldn't see. It was during this period that Earl began what would become his signature method of operation, ingratiating himself with older women who showed him maternal kindness. Mrs. Anna Becker, a 60-year-old widow who ran a small boarding house near the hospital, took pity on the seemingly devout young man and offered him room and board in exchange for maintenance work. She would later describe him as the most polite young man you could imagine, always ready with a Bible verse and a helping hand. But even Mrs. Becker noticed troubling signs. She found disturbing drawings hidden in his room, crude sketches that seemed to depict women in various states of undress and distress. When she confronted him about them, Earl's explanation was both bizarre and unsettling. He claimed they were illustrations of fallen angels that came to him in religious visions. More disturbing was his habit of wandering the boarding house at night, often found standing motionless outside the rooms of female tenants, claiming he was standing guard against evil spirits. The pattern that would define his future crimes was already emerging: the careful cultivation of trust with older women, followed by increasingly inappropriate behavior that pushed the boundaries of acceptable conduct. When Mrs. Becker finally asked him to leave after discovering him in the room of an elderly female tenant in the middle of the night, Earl's response provided a chilling glimpse of the violence to come. He destroyed furniture throughout the boarding house, ripped pages from every Bible he could find, and before leaving, whispered to Mrs. Becker, "You have cast out an angel of the Lord. The price for such sin is always death." Mrs. Becker would survive Earl's early years, but her experience established the template that would claim 22 other women across America. By 1919, Earl had begun moving from city to city, leaving behind a trail of disturbed landladies and concerned authorities who lacked the resources or legal framework to track a man whose crimes had not yet escalated to murder. His first documented killing occurred on February 20th, 1926, in San Francisco, though investigators would later theorize that earlier victims may have been misclassified as natural deaths or accidents. Clara Newman, a 60-year-old widow who ran a boarding house on Fillmore Street, was found dead in her apartment by another tenant who had become concerned when she failed to appear for their daily morning tea. The crime scene told a story that would become horrifyingly familiar to investigators across 2 countries. Clara's body was found on her bed, fully clothed, but with signs of manual strangulation clearly visible on her neck. The apartment showed signs of a struggle, but nothing appeared to have been stolen. Most disturbing to the investigating officers was the position of the body, arranged in what appeared to be a peaceful, almost reverent pose, with a Bible placed on her chest and her hands folded in prayer. Detective Lieutenant Charles Dullier of the San Francisco Police Department, who would become one of the few investigators to recognize the emerging pattern, noted several unusual aspects of the crime scene. The perpetrator showed an intimate knowledge of the victim's daily routine, he wrote in his initial report. Entry was gained not through force, but apparently through invitation. The victim's prayer book was open to Psalm 23, and there were signs that tea had been prepared for 2 people, though only 1 cup showed evidence of use. What Dullier couldn't have known at the time was that he was looking at the handiwork of America's first documented serial killer who combined sexual violence with elaborate post-mortem rituals. The positioning of Clara's body, the religious artifacts, and the lack of obvious sexual assault created a crime scene unlike anything in the department's experience. The investigation stalled within weeks, classified as a robbery gone wrong despite the lack of missing property. Earl had disappeared from San Francisco within days of Clara's murder, but not before establishing the pattern that would define the next 15 months of terror. He would target older women who ran boarding houses or lived alone, women whose natural tendency toward Christian charity made them vulnerable to a young man who could quote scripture and present himself as a devout believer in need of help. His next documented victim was Mrs. Laura Beale, found dead in her Portland, Oregon boarding house on April 10, 1926. The similarities to Clara Newman's murder were striking, but with no system in place for sharing information between police departments, the connection went unnoticed. Mrs. Beale's body showed the same signs of manual strangulation, the same careful positioning, and the same religious staging. But there were differences that suggested an escalation in the killer's pathology. Mrs. Beale's nightgown had been torn, and medical examination revealed evidence of sexual assault that had occurred after death. Detective Raymond Hickey, who investigated the case for the Portland Police Bureau, noted in his report, "The perpetrator appears to have spent considerable time with the victim's body after death. The careful arrangement of religious articles and the evidence of post-mortem sexual contact suggest a killer whose motivations extend far beyond robbery or simple violence." Hickey's observations were remarkably prescient, but like his colleagues in San Francisco, he lacked the resources to pursue the case beyond the local level. The investigation focused on Mrs. Beale's regular tenants and known associates, missing entirely the soft-spoken young man who had rented a room for just 3 days before disappearing without paying his bill. By the summer of 1926, Earl Leonard Nelson, he had begun using his middle name as a surname to distance himself from his troubled past, was moving through the Pacific Northwest like a predatory spectre, leaving behind a trail of strangled landladies and baffled police departments. The victims followed a consistent pattern. Women between 50 and 70 years old, living alone or in charge of boarding houses, strangled in their own bedrooms and arranged in poses that suggested both reverence and violation. Mrs. Beata Withers in Seattle, found dead on June 8th with her Bible open to Revelations and her body positioned as if in peaceful sleep. Mrs. Virginia Grant in Spokane, discovered on July 23rd by tenants who had become concerned when she failed to collect their weekly rent. Mrs. Mabel Fluke in Portland again, killed on August 15th in an attack so vicious that investigating officers initially suspected multiple perpetrators. Each crime scene told the same story. A killer who gained entry through manipulation rather than force, who spent considerable time with his victims both before and after death, and who possessed an intimate knowledge of Christian scripture that he used both to gain trust and to justify his actions. Detectives in each city noted the religious staging, but without a coordinated investigation, the pattern remained invisible to law enforcement. The breakthrough that might have saved lives came from an unexpected source: the victims themselves. Mrs. Withers, found clutching a piece of torn fabric that DNA analysis would later prove came from her killer's clothing. Mrs. Grant, who had managed to scratch her attacker deeply enough to leave skin cells under her fingernails. Mrs. Fluke, who had apparently fought back with enough vigor to force her killer to flee, leaving behind a distinctive religious medallion torn from his neck during the struggle. Detective Dahlia in San Francisco was the first to recognize the emerging pattern when he received a telegram from his counterpart in Portland describing Mrs. Beale's murder. The similarities were too striking to ignore: the religious staging, the careful positioning of bodies, the lack of obvious theft despite clear opportunity. Dahlia began corresponding with investigators throughout the Pacific Northwest, slowly building a profile of a killer whose methodology was unlike anything in criminal history. We are dealing with a perpetrator whose psychological profile defies conventional understanding, Dullier wrote in a report to his superiors in August 1926. The combination of religious obsession, sexual pathology, and sophisticated victim selection suggests an individual whose mental state operates according to internal logic that bears no resemblance to normal human behavior. The killer's ability to gain the trust of victims suggests considerable charm and manipulation skills, while the post-mortem rituals indicate a level of psychological derangement that places him among the most dangerous criminals we have ever encountered. Dullier's assessment was accurate, but his warnings fell on deaf ears. Police departments in the 1920s were ill-equipped to handle crimes that crossed jurisdictional boundaries, and the concept of serial killing was not yet understood by law enforcement or the public. Each murder was investigated as an isolated incident, allowing Nelson to continue his deadly migration across America without interference. The fall of 1926 saw an escalation in both the frequency and brutality of Nelson's attacks. Mrs. Blanche Myers in San Jose found dead on September 19th with evidence of torture that suggested the killer had spent hours with his victim before finally strangling her. Mrs. Ollie Russell in Santa Barbara discovered on October 2nd in a state that horrified even experienced investigators. The religious staging had become more elaborate, with biblical passages written in the victim's blood on bedroom walls and mirrors. But it was the murder of Mrs. Mary Nesbitt in Oakland on October 27th that finally provided investigators with their first real clue to the killer's identity. Mrs. Nesbitt, a widow who ran a small boarding house near the waterfront, had mentioned to neighbours that she had rented a room to a polite young man who claimed to be a travelling Bible salesman. When her body was discovered, tenants recalled seeing the man leaving the boarding house on the morning of her death, carrying a small suitcase and what appeared to be several Bibles. The description provided by witnesses was consistent across all sightings: a man in his late 20s, average height but powerfully built, with dark hair and what several witnesses described as the most unsettling smile. He dressed conservatively, often in dark suits that gave him the appearance of a minister or travelling salesman. Most significantly, he carried multiple Bibles and was often seen reading scripture in public places, particularly in parks and near churches. Detective Dullier recognized immediately that they were dealing with a killer who used religious faith as both camouflage and hunting ground. The boarding houses weren't random targets. They were carefully selected based on the religious devotion of their operators. Nelson was using church directories, religious publications, and personal reconnaissance to identify women whose Christian charity would make them vulnerable to his particular brand of manipulation. The investigation took on new urgency in November 1926, when the killer's pattern suddenly shifted. Instead of remaining in California, Nelson began moving eastward, leaving behind victims in Nevada, Utah, and Colorado. The change in geography was accompanied by an increase in violence that suggested his psychological deterioration was accelerating. Mrs. Jenny Randolph in Reno found dead on November 15th with injuries so severe that the coroner initially refused to allow press access to crime scene photographs. Mrs. Edith Crawford in Denver discovered on December 3rd in a state that suggested the killer had spent days with her body, subjecting it to ritualistic abuse that combined sexual violence with religious symbolism in ways that defied rational explanation. By the winter of 1926 to 1927, newspaper editors across the western United States were beginning to notice the pattern that law enforcement had been slow to recognize. The San Francisco Chronicle was the first major publication to suggest that the boarding house murders might be connected, running a series of articles that traced the geographical progression of similar crimes and called for coordinated law enforcement response. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Boarding house operators throughout the West began turning away single male tenants, particularly those who presented themselves as religious travelers. Churches found themselves in the uncomfortable position of warning parishioners about strangers who claimed to be fellow believers. The atmosphere of suspicion and fear that settled over American communities was unlike anything in the nation's experience. But Nelson was already adapting to increased scrutiny, modifying his approach to avoid detection while continuing to claim victims. Instead of staying in boarding houses, he began targeting women in their private homes, using newspaper obituaries to identify recent widows who lived alone. The shift in methodology demonstrated a level of criminal sophistication that chilled investigators who were beginning to understand the scope of his activities. Mrs. Pearl Hightower in Kansas City found dead in her home on January 8, 1927, after failing to appear at her husband's graveside on the anniversary of his death. Mrs. Rose Valdez in St. Louis, discovered on February 14th by her daughter, who had come to deliver Valentine's Day flowers. Each crime scene bore Nelson's signature: manual strangulation, religious staging, and evidence of post-mortem sexual assault that grew more elaborate and disturbing with each victim. The investigation that would finally bring Nelson to justice began with a single observant witness in Detroit, Michigan. Mrs. Catherine May, an elderly woman who lived across the street from boarding house operator Mrs. Maureen Atwood, noticed a young man entering Mrs. Atwood's establishment on the evening of March 2nd, 1927. What caught Mrs. May's attention was not just the visitor's late arrival, but his behavior after Mrs. Atwood let him inside. He kept looking around like he was checking to see if anyone was watching, Mrs. May later told investigators. And when she opened the door for him, I could see he was carrying what looked like 2 or 3 Bibles. That struck me as odd for someone arriving so late in the evening. Mrs. May's suspicions proved tragically accurate. When Mrs. Atwood failed to appear for her regular morning walk with neighbours, concerned friends discovered her body in her bedroom. The crime scene was consistent with Nelson's previous work, but with one crucial difference. This time, he had been careless. In his haste to leave Detroit, possibly spooked by Mrs. May's obvious attention to his comings and goings, Nelson had left behind several personal items, including a religious medallion engraved with the initials EN, and a notebook containing what appeared to be potential victim lists, organized by city and religious affiliation. Most significantly, he had registered at Mrs. Atwood's boarding house under the name E. Nelson, providing investigators with their first solid lead to his identity. Detective Inspector Walter Storm of the Detroit Police Department recognized immediately that they were dealing with their most significant break in what had become a multi-state investigation. Working with his colleagues in other cities, Storm began building a comprehensive profile of their suspect that went far beyond physical description to include psychological assessment and behavioral prediction. "We are hunting a man whose mental state operates according to a private mythology that combines sexual pathology with religious delusion," Storm wrote in a report that would later be cited as pioneering work in criminal profiling. "His victim selection is methodical and planned, suggesting intelligence and organizational ability, but his post-crime behavior indicates deteriorating impulse control. The escalation in violence and frequency suggests he is approaching a psychological breaking point that will either result in capture or a final, catastrophic episode of violence." Storm's assessment proved prophetic. By April 1927, Nelson was moving through the northern United States with increasing desperation, his careful methodology breaking down as psychological pressure and law enforcement attention made his traditional approach more dangerous. The victims from this period, Mrs. Anna Edmonds in Buffalo, Mrs. Sarah Murphy in Rochester, Mrs. Helen Patterson in Syracuse, showed signs of having been killed more quickly and with less elaborate post-mortem ritual, suggesting a killer whose compulsions were overwhelming his caution. The end came in Winnipeg, Manitoba, where Nelson had fled after the heat in American cities became too intense to bear. On June 9, 1927, he approached Mrs. Emily Patterson, a 58-year-old widow who operated a small boarding house near the city centre. Mrs. Patterson, unaware of the terror that had been stalking boarding house operators across North America, welcomed the polite young man, who introduced himself as a travelling Bible salesman. Her murder followed the established pattern, but with a crucial difference. This time, there were witnesses. Emily Patterson's screams were heard by neighbours, who called police immediately. When officers arrived at the boarding house, they found evidence of a struggle that had clearly been interrupted. Nelson had fled through a rear window, leaving behind not only the crime scene, but also a suitcase containing personal documents, religious materials, and what investigators would later describe as trophies from previous victims. The manhunt that followed was unlike anything Winnipeg had ever experienced. Hundreds of officers, aided by Royal Canadian Mounted Police and volunteer citizens, combed the city for a suspect whose photograph had been distributed to every law enforcement agency in North America. The breakthrough came when Nelson, desperate and increasingly irrational, attempted to attack another woman in broad daylight on a busy Winnipeg street. Mrs. Lola Cowan was walking to her job at a local department store when a man matching Nelson's description approached her, claiming to be lost and asking for directions to the nearest church. Something in his manner, what she later described as eyes that looked right through you like you weren't even human, triggered her survival instincts. When he grabbed her arm and began pulling her toward an alley, Mrs. Cowan screamed and fought back with enough vigour to draw the attention of passers-by. The citizen's arrest that followed was chaotic and violent. Nelson, cornered and desperate, fought with the strength of a man facing execution. It took 5 men to subdue him, and even then he continued to struggle, quoting biblical passages about divine judgment and claiming that his victims had been delivered unto righteousness through holy suffering. The trial that followed in Winnipeg became an international sensation, drawing reporters and legal experts from around the world. For the first time, the full scope of Nelson's crimes was revealed to the public, creating a portrait of evil that challenged contemporary understanding of criminal behaviour and mental illness. Dr. James Grasset, one of Canada's leading alienists, conducted extensive psychological evaluation of Nelson while he awaited trial. Grasset's reports, later published in medical journals, provided unprecedented insight into the mind of a serial killer. The subject presents a complex psychological profile that defies traditional classification, Grasset wrote. His religious delusions are not symptoms of conventional psychosis, but rather elaborate justifications for sexual and violent impulses that appear to have neurological origins. The combination of brain injury, childhood trauma, and possible genetic predisposition has created an individual whose internal reality bears no resemblance to consensual human experience. Perhaps most chilling was Grasset's analysis of Nelson's relationship with his victims. Through extensive interviews, the alienist discovered that Nelson did not view his crimes as murders, but rather as sacred ceremonies that transformed his victims from fallen women into purified souls. The post-mortem sexual assault, Nelson explained with disturbing calm, was not desecration, but rather the final sacrament that completes their journey to righteousness. The trial itself lasted 2 weeks, during which prosecutors presented evidence linking Nelson to murders across the United States and Canada. The testimony of survivors like Mrs. Cowan, combined with physical evidence and witness statements from multiple crime scenes, painted a picture of a killer whose methodical approach and sophisticated victim selection marked him as something unprecedented in criminal history. Nelson's defense, led by attorney James Stanton, focused on the extensive evidence of mental illness and brain damage. Medical experts testified about the effects of childhood syphilis and traumatic head injury on developing brain tissue, creating a compelling argument for legal insanity. But the careful planning evident in Nelson's crimes combined with his ability to evade capture for over a year, undermined claims that he was unable to distinguish right from wrong. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all charges. When asked if he had any final words before sentencing, Nelson stood and delivered what witnesses described as a sermon that lasted nearly 20 minutes, combining biblical quotations with rambling justifications for his actions that left even experienced court reporters shaken. "I have been an instrument of the Lord's will," he declared, his voice carrying the same unsettling calm that had characterized his interactions with victims. "The women I have delivered from this world were consumed by sin and corruption. Through their purification, they have achieved a state of grace that they could never have reached in life. I do not seek forgiveness, for I have committed no crime in the eyes of the Almighty." Judge Marcus Dennison, clearly disturbed by Nelson's complete lack of remorse, imposed the maximum sentence available under Canadian law: death by hanging. The execution was carried out on January 13th, 1928, at Stony Mountain Penitentiary, bringing to an end a criminal career that had claimed at least 22 lives and terrorized communities across 2 nations. But the story of Earl Leonard Nelson extends far beyond his crimes and execution. His case became a watershed moment in the development of criminal psychology and investigative techniques, providing law enforcement with their first detailed study of what would later be recognized as serial killing behavior. The investigative methods developed by detectives like Charles Dullier and Walter Storm, who recognized the importance of coordinating information across jurisdictions and building psychological profiles of unknown suspects, became foundations for modern criminal investigation. Perhaps more significantly, Nelson's case forced American society to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of evil and the vulnerability of those who extend Christian charity to strangers. The boarding house murders shattered assumptions about safety and community trust that had defined American social life, creating a climate of suspicion that would influence social behavior for generations. The victims, Nelson claimed, were more than statistics in a criminal case. They were women whose lives had meaning and value beyond their tragic ends. Clara Newman, who had survived the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, only to die at the hands of a madman 20 years later. Laura Beale, who had raised 6 children as a single mother and operated her boarding house as an informal community center for lonely travelers. Each woman had shown kindness to a stranger who repaid their charity with violence and death. The psychological analysis of Nelson's case continued long after his execution, as medical professionals sought to understand the neurological and social factors that had created such a monster. Modern forensic psychiatrists, examining the historical record with contemporary knowledge of brain function and criminal behavior, have identified Nelson as a textbook example of how multiple risk factors, genetic predisposition, childhood trauma, brain injury, and social isolation can combine to create catastrophic criminal behavior. The religious component of Nelson's psychopathy remains particularly disturbing to researchers. Unlike killers who use religious imagery as mere camouflage, Nelson appears to have genuinely believed that his actions were divinely sanctioned. His ability to quote scripture accurately and discuss theological concepts with sophistication made him particularly dangerous to victims whose faith made them vulnerable to his manipulation. The case also highlighted systemic failures in law enforcement and mental health care that allowed Nelson's crimes to continue for as long as they did. The lack of communication between police departments, the absence of coordinated investigative techniques, and the primitive understanding of mental illness all contributed to his ability to evade capture while claiming victim after victim. When Earl Leonard Nelson was finally executed in the early morning hours of January 13th, 1928, witnesses reported that his final words were a prayer asking not for forgiveness, but for divine approval of his actions. He went to his death convinced that he had been an agent of God's will, a delusion that had motivated one of the most horrific criminal careers in American history. The letter he had sent to the San Francisco Chronicle, confessing to his crimes and attempting to justify them, became one of the most studied documents in criminal psychology. His claim that he couldn't help himself, while simultaneously expressing no remorse for his actions, provided insight into a mind that operated according to logic, so twisted that it bore no resemblance to normal human psychology. Today, nearly a century after his crimes, Earl Nelson remains a subject of study for criminal psychologists and law enforcement professionals, seeking to understand the origins of serial killing behavior. His case established many of the investigative techniques still used in hunting serial killers, while his psychological profile helped define our understanding of how childhood trauma and brain injury can create monsters who walk among us wearing human faces. The boarding houses where he claimed his victims are long gone, replaced by modern buildings that bear no trace of the horror they once witnessed. But the lessons learned from investigating his crimes continue to protect potential victims from predators who use charm and manipulation to gain access to those they intend to harm. In that sense, the women who died at Nelson's hands did not die entirely in vain. Their sacrifice helped law enforcement develop the tools necessary to catch the killers who followed. The Dark Strangler's reign of terror lasted just over a year, but its impact on American criminal justice and our understanding of human evil continues to this day. In the end, perhaps that is Earl Leonard Nelson's most lasting legacy. Not the lives he took, but the knowledge gained from studying his crimes that helps protect the innocent from those who would follow in his bloody footsteps. The voice in the dark. The emergency dispatcher's headset crackled to life at 3:07 a.m. on September 13th, 2016, in Ashland County, Ohio. What followed would become one of the most harrowing 911 recordings in criminal history, a whispered conversation between life and death that would finally silence one of America's most elusive serial killers. 911. What is your emergency? The dispatcher's routine greeting met only silence, then the faintest whisper of a woman's voice. I've been abducted. Jane Doe, as she would be known in court records to protect her identity, lay bound in the upstairs bedroom of an abandoned house at 363 Covert Court in Ashland, Ohio. Her captor, 39-year-old Sean Michael Great, slept just feet away, exhausted from 3 days of unspeakable violence. In the suffocating darkness of that September morning, Jane summoned every ounce of courage to reach for the phone Great had carelessly left within her reach. For the next 13 minutes and 37 seconds, she would conduct a desperate ballet of survival, her voice barely audible as she guided police to her location, while her captor's breathing remained steady in sleep. Neither she nor the dispatcher could have known that her whispered words were simultaneously ending a decade-long killing spree that had claimed the lives of at least 5 women across Ohio's rural heartland. The house at 363 Covert Court stood like a monument to urban decay in Ashland's forgotten corners. Once a proud 2-story home built in the 1920s, decades of neglect had transformed it into something more sinister. Paint peeled from its weathered siding in long strips, revealing the rotting wood beneath. Windows were boarded up with plywood that bore the scars of countless break-ins and temporary occupations by the city's homeless population. The front porch sagged under the weight of collapsed roof sections, and weeds grew tall enough to obscure the foundation. It was here, in this monument to abandonment, that Sean Great had made his killing ground. Born on August 8, 1976, in Marion County, Ohio, Sean Michael Great entered a world that seemed destined to shape him into something monstrous. His childhood unfolded in the small industrial town of Marion, where factory smokestacks dominated the skyline and economic desperation had settled into the community like permanent fog. His mother, Linda Great, worked multiple jobs to support her children after Sean's father disappeared from their lives when the boy was barely walking. The absence of a father figure would become a recurring theme in psychological evaluations years later, though experts would debate whether this void created or merely contributed to the darkness that would eventually consume him. As a child, Great displayed troubling behaviours that his overwhelmed mother either missed or chose to ignore. Neighbours would later recall finding mutilated animals in their yards, cats with missing limbs, dogs with inexplicable injuries, though no one connected these incidents to the quiet boy who lived 3 houses down on East Centre Street. Teachers at Marion Elementary described him as withdrawn and prone to violent outbursts when challenged. By age 12, he had been suspended multiple times for fighting and once for bringing a knife to school, claiming he needed it for protection. The progression from troubled child to predatory adult followed a disturbingly predictable pattern. At 14, Great was arrested for his first sexual offence, attempting to assault a neighbour girl who was walking home from school. The juvenile court system, overwhelmed and underfunded, processed him through a brief stint in counselling and released him back to his mother's custody with little more than a warning. It was a decision that would haunt the community for decades to come. High school brought new opportunities for violence. Great's classmates at Marion Harding High School remembered him as a loner who seemed to harbour deep resentment toward women. Female students reported feeling uncomfortable around him, describing how he would stare with an intensity that made their skin crawl. Several filed complaints with school administrators about his behaviour, but in the pre-Columbine era of American education, such warnings rarely resulted in meaningful intervention. The first documented murder occurred on September 12, 2006, though investigators would later theorise that Great's actual body count began years earlier. Candace Cunningham, a 29-year-old mother of 2 from Marion, vanished after leaving her job at a local factory. Her body was discovered 3 weeks later in a wooded area off State Route 4, bearing signs of sexual assault and strangulation. The Marion County Sheriff's Department investigated thoroughly, but found no viable leads. DNA evidence was collected, but would remain unmatched in databases for nearly a decade. Cunningham's murder established a pattern that would define Great's methodology for years to come. He targeted vulnerable women, those struggling with addiction, homelessness, or domestic violence, women whose disappearances might not trigger immediate intensive investigations. He understood intuitively that society's most marginalized members were also its most easily forgotten, and he exploited this tragic reality with calculated precision. The killing ground at 363 Covert Court became his base of operations around 2014, when Great discovered that the abandoned property offered perfect isolation for his crimes. Located in a neighborhood where foreclosed homes outnumbered occupied ones, the house provided natural camouflage for his activities. He learned the routines of the few remaining neighbors, noting when they left for work and returned home. He mapped the sightlines from surrounding properties and identified the times of day when he could move in and out undetected. Inside the house, Great created a carefully organized space for murder. The upstairs bedroom where Jane would eventually be held became his primary location for assaults. He removed all furniture except for a mattress, which he positioned in the center of the room. Ropes and restraints were stored in a closet nearby, along with various tools he used to inflict pain. Most chillingly, investigators would later discover that he had soundproofed portions of the room using old blankets and cardboard, ensuring that his victims' screams would never reach the outside world. Stacey Stanley's murder in 2007 followed the same methodical approach. The 34-year-old single mother from Bucyrus, Ohio, was last seen leaving a local bar on a Friday night in March. Her body was found 6 days later in a rural area of Crawford County, showing signs of prolonged torture before her death. Like Cunningham, Stanley had struggled with addiction and had limited contact with family members who might have reported her missing quickly. The Crawford County Sheriff's Department worked the case diligently, but found themselves facing the same dead ends that had stymied investigators in Marion County. What law enforcement agencies across central Ohio didn't realize was that they were hunting the same predator. Communication between rural departments was limited by jurisdictional boundaries and resource constraints. Each agency worked its cases in isolation, never recognizing that the similarities in victim selection, assault patterns, and disposal methods pointed to a single killer operating across county lines. The years 2008 through 2012 represented Great's most active period, though the full extent of his crimes during this time may never be known. Elizabeth Griffith, a 28-year-old woman from Ashland County, disappeared in August 2010 after leaving her apartment to meet someone she had connected with online. Her body was never found, but cell phone records showed her last known location as being within a mile of 363 Covert Court. Investigators would later discover that Great had been using various online personas to lure women to secluded locations, often posing as someone offering employment or housing assistance. The disappearance of Rebecca Lisi in 2012 marked a turning point in Great's evolution as a killer. Lisi, a 23-year-old from Ashland, was last seen getting into a vehicle matching the description of Great's pickup truck. Her decomposed remains were discovered in September 2016, just days after Jane's rescue, in the basement of the abandoned house where Great had held his final victim. Forensic examination revealed that Lisi had been kept alive for several days before her murder, suggesting that Great's methods were becoming increasingly elaborate and sadistic. By 2013, Great had refined his hunting techniques to an unsettling degree of sophistication. He studied the schedules and habits of potential victims, often conducting surveillance for weeks before making contact. He learned which women were estranged from family members, who struggled with addiction, and who lived transient lifestyles that made them unlikely to be missed quickly. This research phase became as important to him as the murders themselves, representing a form of psychological foreplay that heightened his anticipation and sense of control. The murder of Dana Nicole Lowry in June 2016 would prove to be Great's penultimate crime, though investigators wouldn't discover her remains until after his arrest. Lowry, a 23-year-old mother from Marion County, had been reported missing by her grandmother when she failed to pick up her young daughter from daycare. Security camera footage from a gas station showed her getting into a truck that investigators would later identify as belonging to Great. Her body was found in the abandoned house, bearing evidence of torture that suggested she had been held captive for nearly a week before her death. The pattern of prolonged captivity represented a significant escalation in Great's methodology. Earlier, victims appeared to have been killed relatively quickly after abduction, but beginning with Rebecca Lisi, he began keeping women alive for extended periods. This change reflected a growing confidence in his ability to operate undetected, but it also revealed a deepening sadism that would ultimately lead to his downfall. Jane Doe's abduction on September 10, 2016, followed Great's established pattern with terrifying precision. She was walking alone near downtown Ashland when Great approached her in his pickup truck, offering her a ride to a friend's house. Jane, who had been struggling with homelessness and addiction, accepted the offer. Instead of taking her to safety, Great drove directly to 363 Covert Court, where he would hold her captive for 3 days. The details of Jane's captivity, as revealed in court testimony and police interviews, illustrate the calculated nature of Great's crimes. He had prepared the upstairs bedroom specifically for her arrival, with restraints already in place and various implements of torture arranged nearby. He told her explicitly that she would not be leaving alive, describing in detail how he had killed previous women in the same room. This psychological torture was as important to him as the physical violence, as he seemed to derive particular satisfaction from his victims' terror and despair. On the evening of September 12th, Great made a crucial error that would end his decade-long killing spree. Exhausted from days of violence and feeling secure in his victims' restraints, he fell into a deep sleep without properly securing his cell phone. Jane, who had been working frantically to loosen her bonds during the hours he slept, managed to reach the device and dial 911. The emergency call that followed became a masterpiece of survival instinct and courage under unimaginable pressure. Jane's whispered conversation with dispatcher Steve Eichinger demonstrated remarkable presence of mind, as she provided just enough information to guide police to her location without waking her captor. When Eichinger asked for the address, Jane could only whisper that she was in an abandoned house near Covert Court. When he asked if she was injured, her barely audible yes carried the weight of 3 days of unspeakable trauma. The most chilling moment in the recording came when Great stirred in his sleep, causing Jane to fall completely silent for nearly 2 minutes while Eichinger waited on the line, not daring to speak and potentially alert her captor. The sound of Great's breathing, audible through the phone, provided a terrifying soundtrack to those moments when Jane's life hung in the balance. Ashland police officers arrived at 363 Covert Court at 3:24 a.m., just 17 minutes after Jane's call began. The response team, led by Sergeant Kim Mager, approached the house with extreme caution, aware that they were likely dealing with an active hostage situation. The building's boarded windows and overgrown vegetation provided perfect cover for the officers as they surrounded the structure and identified possible entry points. The rescue operation unfolded with precision that would later be praised by law enforcement agencies across Ohio. Officers entered through the back door, which Great had left unlocked, and moved systematically through the first floor before locating the stairs to the second level. The sound of their approach woke Great, who attempted to flee through a second-floor window but was immediately apprehended by officers positioned outside. Jane's rescue at 3:31 a.m. marked the end of one of Ohio's most prolific serial killing sprees, but the investigation into Great's crimes was just beginning. The abandoned house at 363 Covert Court would become the center of one of the most extensive forensic examinations in state history as investigators worked to uncover the full scope of his decade-long reign of terror. The basement of the house revealed a chamber of horrors that shocked even veteran investigators. The remains of at least 2 victims were discovered buried beneath the dirt floor, along with personal belongings from numerous other women who had never been reported missing. DNA evidence collected from the scene would eventually link Great to murders across 5 different counties, spanning a timeline that stretched back more than a decade. Great's arrest on September 13, 2016, brought relief to communities across central Ohio, but it also raised troubling questions about how one man had managed to kill for so long without detection. The investigation revealed a pattern of missed opportunities and communication failures that had allowed him to operate across jurisdictional boundaries without triggering any coordinated response from law enforcement agencies. The trial of Sean Great began on April 23, 2018, in Richland County Common Pleas Court. Prosecutor Gary Bishop presented a case that relied heavily on physical evidence, DNA matches, and Jane's courageous testimony about her 3 days of captivity. The 911 recording was played in its entirety for the jury, creating a courtroom atmosphere so tense that several spectators had to leave during the most harrowing moments. Great's defense team, led by attorney Robert Whitney, attempted to argue that their client suffered from severe mental illness that prevented him from understanding the nature of his crimes. However, the overwhelming evidence of premeditation and sophisticated planning made this strategy largely ineffective. Forensic psychologists testified that while Great certainly exhibited antisocial personality disorder and psychopathic traits. He clearly understood the difference between right and wrong, and had gone to great lengths to avoid detection. The prosecution's case was strengthened by testimony from Jane, who faced her captor in court with remarkable composure. Her description of the 3 days she spent at 363 Covert Court provided crucial insight into Great's methods and mindset. She testified that he had spoken extensively about previous victims, describing their murders in detail and showing her items he had kept as trophies. This testimony helped prosecutors establish the premeditated nature of his crimes and demonstrated the calculated cruelty that defined his approach to murder. On May 7, 2018, after deliberating for less than 2 hours, the jury found Sean Great guilty on all counts, including aggravated murder, kidnapping, rape, and abuse of a corpse. The verdict brought a measure of justice for the families of his known victims, though many questions about the full extent of his crimes remained unanswered. During the penalty phase of the trial, victim impact statements provided heartbreaking insight into the lives that Great had destroyed. Candace Cunningham's mother spoke about the decade of uncertainty her family had endured, not knowing what had happened to her daughter until DNA evidence finally provided answers. Rebecca Lisi's father described the torment of searching for his daughter for 4 years, following every lead and clinging to hope that she might still be alive. The judge sentenced Great to death on May 9, 2018, citing the heinous nature of his crimes and the suffering he had inflicted on his victims and their families. The sentence was later commuted to life in prison without the possibility of parole when Ohio suspended its death penalty program, ensuring that Great would never again have the opportunity to harm another person. The case of Sean Great exposed significant weaknesses in how law enforcement agencies across Ohio shared information and coordinated investigations. In response to these failures, the state implemented new protocols for multi-jurisdictional communication and established a specialized unit for investigating serial crimes. The VICAP, Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, database became a mandatory reporting tool for all unsolved murders and sexual assaults, helping to identify patterns that might indicate serial offending. Jane's courage in making that whispered 911 call has been recognized by law enforcement agencies across the country as an example of survival instinct at its most remarkable. Her ability to remain calm and provide crucial information while her captor slept nearby demonstrated extraordinary presence of mind under unimaginable pressure. The Ashland Police Department credited her actions with not only saving her own life, but potentially preventing additional murders. The abandoned house at 363 Covert Court was demolished in November 2016, but its legacy continues to haunt the community. Residents of the surrounding neighborhood reported feeling a sense of relief when the structure was finally torn down, as if removing the physical reminder of Great's crimes could somehow cleanse the area of its dark history. The empty lot where the house once stood has been maintained as a small memorial garden, where family members of Great's victims sometimes leave flowers and personal remembrances. The investigation into Great's crimes remains technically active as law enforcement agencies continue to examine cold cases that might be connected to his decade-long killing spree. DNA evidence collected from his known crime scenes is regularly compared against samples from unsolved murders across the Midwest, and investigators estimate that his actual victim count may be significantly higher than the 5 confirmed murders for which he was convicted. The psychological profile that emerged during Great's trial painted a picture of a predator who evolved over time, becoming increasingly sophisticated in his methods and more sadistic in his approach. Dr. Catherine Morrison, a forensic psychologist who testified for the prosecution, described him as a classic example of an organized serial killer who planned his crimes meticulously and learned from each murder to refine his techniques. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of society's most marginalized members. as Great deliberately targeted women whose disappearances might not trigger immediate intensive investigations. This tragic reality reflects broader societal issues about how we value different lives and respond to violence against vulnerable populations. Advocacy groups have used Great's case to push for better resources and support systems for homeless individuals, addiction recovery programs, and domestic violence survivors. Today, Sean Great remains on Ohio's death row at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution, where he is registered as Inmate A 730977 and awaits further federal review. In March 2022, the Ohio Supreme Court unanimously upheld his convictions and death sentences, rejecting claims of ineffective counsel and evidentiary error. The case is now in the federal habeas phase, and no execution date has been set. Prison officials report that he has shown no remorse for his actions and continues to maintain that his victims deserved what they got. This continued lack of empathy reinforces the assessment that he represents a permanent danger to society and validates the decision to ensure he never has another opportunity to harm innocent people. The legacy of Sean Great's crimes extends far beyond the lives he destroyed and the families he shattered. His case serves as a stark reminder of the importance of believing victims, supporting vulnerable populations, and maintaining vigilant communication between law enforcement agencies. The whispered 911 call that ended his killing spree has become a powerful symbol of survival and courage, demonstrating that even in the darkest moments, the human spirit can find a way to fight back against evil. In the end, the voice in the dark that saved Jane's life also gave voice to all of Great's victims, ensuring that their stories would be heard and their killer would face justice. The 13 minutes and 37 seconds of that September morning phone call represent far more than a successful rescue operation. They stand as testament to the power of courage in the face of unimaginable terror and the importance of never giving up hope, even when surrounded by the deepest darkness.